In 1943, the Allies launched an invasion that would turn Italy into a furnace of fire, blood and relentless battle. Every hill, valley and village became a battlefield where survival was never guaranteed. The sun-scorched beaches of Sicily, the rugged Apennine mountains, and the narrow valleys of the Italian countryside would soon witness a clash of empires as Allied forces sought to breach the Axis defences and bring the war closer to the heart of Europe. For Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of Europe, this was no simple campaign. It was a brutal test of endurance, strategy, and sheer human will. German and Italian forces, entrenched in fortified positions, utilized every natural obstacle and tactical advantage to slow the invaders, turning towns, rivers, and hills into deadly strongpoints. Across the beaches, soldiers from America, Britain, Canada, and beyond stormed into a world of chaos, artillery shells screaming overhead, smoke billowing from burning vehicles, and the cries of the wounded mingling with the relentless thunder of naval bombardment. Behind the front lines, civilians endured unimaginable hardships, homes reduced to rubble, fields set ablaze, and towns caught in the crossfire between advancing and retreating armies. Every valley was contested, every ridge fought over, and every road an arena of peril, as tanks, infantry, and aircraft waged a relentless struggle for control. From the initial landings in Sicily to the grueling push up the Italian peninsula, this campaign tested not only the tactics of generals and the courage of soldiers, but also the resilience of ordinary people caught in the maelstrom of war. Tonight we bring you the entire story of the battle for Italy, the planning, the courage, the strategy, the betrayals, the heroism, and the devastating toll on soldiers and civilians alike. So close your eyes, let the sounds and sights of history envelop you, and before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is, because together, across continents and generations, we relive the relentless push for Italy and the battles that shaped the outcome of World War II. In the summer of 1940, Benito Mussolini believed he stood on the threshold of becoming a great conqueror, convinced that Italy would rise as a new Roman Empire. Yet within just 2 years, his bold illusions were shattered by military disasters that revealed the fragility of his regime. In North Africa, Italian troops marched with poor equipment, outdated tanks, and limited supplies against the seasoned forces of the British Commonwealth. What Mussolini had envisioned as a swift conquest of Egypt instead became a humiliating retreat. The Italian army's collapse forced Hitler to intervene, sending Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to salvage the situation. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Mussolini had recklessly sent Italian divisions to fight alongside the Wehrmacht against the Soviet Union. These units, poorly equipped for the Russian winter, were decimated in battles along the Don and at Stalingrad. The combined losses left hundreds of thousands of Italian families grieving for sons who never returned home. By 1943, Italy was bleeding manpower and resources on multiple fronts with no clear hope of victory. Mussolini's once charismatic image as the Duce was crumbling before the eyes of his people. The defeats were not just military setbacks, but psychological blows that struck at the heart of Italian morale. Italians who once cheered Mussolini's fiery speeches now questioned whether his words meant anything beyond empty promises. In the countryside, mothers lamented the loss of sons to distant, unnecessary wars. In the cities, workers endured rationing, shortages, and constant air raid sirens as Allied bombers struck industrial centres. Mussolini had promised glory, but instead delivered hunger and fear. The people began whispering in cafes, church squares, and factories that perhaps the Duce had led them into disaster. His grandiose gestures, standing on balconies, pounding his chest, speaking of destiny, now seemed hollow, even grotesque, as reality contradicted every boast. His ministers, generals, and even the king grew uneasy, aware that the tide of war was turning. By early 1943, discontent had reached not only the common people, but also the ruling elite. Italy was becoming a nation in crisis, teetering between loyalty to a fading dictator and the need to save itself from ruin. The North African campaign exposed the deep weaknesses of Italy's armed forces. Italian tanks, such as the Fiat M1340, were thinly armoured and hopelessly outclassed by British Matildas and Crusaders. Italian planes were outdated biplanes or underpowered fighters, unable to compete with Spitfires and Hurricanes. Troops lacked radios, effective logistics, and even basic rations, leaving them vulnerable in the desert. Rommel himself admitted that without German support, the Italian army would have been annihilated within weeks. The disastrous defeat at El Alamein in late 1942 sealed the fate of Mussolini's African dreams. Tens of thousands of Italians were taken prisoner, marched into captivity, and would never see home again. Mussolini's propaganda tried to conceal the scale of the losses, but news trickled back through letters, rumours, and returning wounded soldiers. Italians no longer believed the newspapers, no longer trusted the official bulletins. The failure in Africa, once touted as Italy's gateway to empire, had instead become the graveyard of fascist ambition. On the Eastern Front, Mussolini's gamble was even more catastrophic. Eager to impress Hitler and secure Italy's place as a true Axis partner, Mussolini dispatched over 200,000 men of the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia. Ill-prepared for the brutal winters, they were given inadequate clothing, poor rations, and outdated weapons. When the Soviets launched their offensives in late 1942, the Italian divisions were shattered. Entire units were encircled, annihilated, or forced into desperate retreats across frozen steppes. Survivors recalled frostbite, starvation, and the sight of comrades collapsing in the snow. By the time the remnants staggered back to Italy, the army was broken and demoralized. Families who had sent their sons eastward received only silence or the dreaded notification of death. The myth of Italian martial glory, carefully cultivated by fascist propaganda, was now exposed as fiction. Mussolini had gambled his nation's blood on Hitler's war, and Italy paid a terrible price. The home front bore the crushing weight of Mussolini's failures. Rationing reduced daily life to queues for bread, meagre portions of meat, and endless shortages of fuel and clothing. Allied bombing raids terrorized cities like Milan, Naples, and Turin, destroying factories and homes. Women and children huddled in shelters, praying for survival as buildings collapsed around them. The promises of prosperity under fascism gave way to misery, fear, and hunger. As hardship deepened, Italians began to resent not just the war, but Mussolini himself. The once vaunted cult of personality faltered as people openly mocked him in whispers. Even within the fascist party, voices of doubt grew louder. Industrialists feared ruin, generals resented interference, and politicians began plotting alternatives. Italy was no longer united under the Duke's vision, but fractured into disillusionment, anger, and despair. The political elite began to recognize that Mussolini had become a liability. King Victor Emmanuel III, cautious and reserved, watched as the Duce's prestige collapsed. The king had once tolerated Mussolini's dominance, but now saw him as dragging Italy into ruin. Within the fascist Grand Council, powerful members like Dino Grandi and Galeazzo Ciano whispered about removing him. They feared that continued loyalty would doom not just fascism, but the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, the Vatican expressed concern over the growing destruction, quietly aligning itself with moderates seeking peace. Even the army high command, weary of defeats, questioned Mussolini's judgment. Where once he had seemed untouchable, he now appeared vulnerable. The state machinery that upheld fascism began to falter, as those who once obeyed unquestioningly now considered betrayal. In the shadows of power, Italy's rulers debated whether the Duce's time was coming to an end. By 1943, the mood in Italy had shifted from obedience to quiet rebellion. Strikes broke out in northern factories, the first serious labour unrest under fascism in 2 decades. Civilians listened secretly to Radio London, desperate for news beyond Mussolini's propaganda. Underground resistance groups, though still small, began to emerge in cities and villages. Soldiers returning from the front spread stories of disaster, further fueling discontent. Mothers confronted officials about their missing sons, demanding answers that never came. The myth of Mussolini as the invincible leader lay shattered by grief, hunger, and rage. Italians who once raised their arms in salute now turned away in silence. Even the most loyal fascist supporters felt their confidence slipping. The cracks in Mussolini's regime were now visible, widening with every defeat, every bombing, every death notice. Italy was a nation on the brink of turning against its own dictator. The fall of Mussolini was not the result of a single battle, but of a slow unravelling of trust, power, and credibility. His ambition to recreate the Roman Empire had instead exposed Italy to devastation and humiliation. The twin disasters of North Africa and Russia left the nation exhausted, grieving, and disillusioned. His people no longer saw him as a leader, but as the architect of their suffering. In palaces, barracks, and piazzas alike, the whispers of betrayal grew louder. The stage was set for dramatic change as Italy stood at the crossroads of collapse and liberation. Mussolini still clung to power, still believed in his destiny, but the tide of history had already turned against him. The failures of his armies had opened the door to political rebellion. Soon the WW2 would face the reckoning of his own people. Italy's crisis had begun, and Mussolini's empire was already crumbling from within. In the aftermath of victory in North Africa, the Allied leadership faced a pressing question: where to strike next? With German forces retreating across the Mediterranean, the Allies sensed an opportunity to exploit the weakness of the Axis in southern Europe. Winston Churchill, ever the strategist and master of persuasion, argued passionately for what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. He believed that by invading Italy, the Allies could avoid the heavily fortified Atlantic wall of northern France, which was bristling with German defences. Churchill saw the Mediterranean as not only a gateway into Europe, but also a theatre where the Allies could use their naval supremacy to full advantage. The American High Command, however, remained sceptical, fearing that Italy would be a diversion from the ultimate goal of invading France. General George Marshall, in particular, pressed for a cross-channel attack sooner rather than later. Yet Roosevelt recognized the political necessity of keeping Britain committed and maintaining Allied unity. Thus, the debate over strategy became not just a military calculation, but also a test of the alliance itself. Churchill's argument was framed in both military and political terms, blending practicality with his gift for rhetoric. He emphasized that Italy, though formally part of the Axis, was already crumbling under the weight of Mussolini's failures. By landing in Italy, the Allies could topple the fascist regime, knock one of Germany's partners out of the war, and open a new front that would drain German resources. Churchill painted a vivid picture: the Alps forming the spine of Europe, and the Allies striking upward through Italy into the heart of the continent. He argued that this path would be less costly than charging directly into northern France in 1943, when the Wehrmacht was still strong. The idea appealed to British strategists who remembered the slaughter of trench warfare in the First World War and sought to avoid repeating it. At the same time, the Mediterranean theatre promised quicker political rewards, since Italy was already teetering on collapse. Churchill believed that the psychological impact of Italy's surrender would reverberate across occupied Europe. To him, striking at Italy was not a delay, but a stepping stone toward ultimate victory. The Americans, however, were wary of what they considered Churchill's penchant for imperial adventures. They saw the Mediterranean as a region of secondary importance compared to the decisive battleground in northern France. General Marshall feared that operations in Italy would bog down Allied forces in a difficult campaign across mountainous terrain. The Americans also worried that Churchill's soft underbelly metaphor was misleading. For Italy was far from soft. It was a land of rugged landscapes, narrow passes, and strong defensive positions. Yet despite their reluctance, the Americans understood the need for compromise. Stalin, who was bearing the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, demanded that the Allies open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. Since a direct assault on France was not yet feasible in 1943, Italy emerged as the logical alternative. Roosevelt, balancing Marshall's caution with Churchill's insistence, leaned toward agreement. By July 1943, the decision was made. The Allies would invade Sicily, the first step in the Mediterranean strategy. The choice of Sicily was both strategic and symbolic. Situated in the centre of the Mediterranean, it served as a vital axis of Axis supply routes. From its airfields, the Germans and Italians could threaten Allied convoys and disrupt operations in North Africa. Capturing the island would not only neutralise this threat, but also provide a springboard into the Italian mainland. For Churchill, Sicily represented the gateway to Mussolini's Italy, a blow that could shatter fascist prestige. The island's capture would demonstrate Allied momentum, reassure the Soviet Union, and prove to the world that the tide of war had truly shifted. Allied planners, particularly General Dwight Eisenhower, who commanded the operation, recognized that Sicily would be a test of coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces. The campaign was also seen as a rehearsal for the larger amphibious operations that would eventually be required in France. Every aspect of the invasion, from logistics to naval gunfire support, would help refine techniques for future assaults. In short, Sicily was not just a target, but a proving ground for the Allied war machine. Churchill's metaphor of the soft underbelly was soon challenged by the harsh realities of geography and defence. Italy was a country of mountains and rivers, natural fortresses that lent themselves to defensive warfare. German generals like Albert Kesselring quickly realised that while Italy might be politically vulnerable, it was militarily formidable. They prepared to transform the peninsula into a killing ground, a place where Allied advances could be delayed at great cost. This irony would haunt the Allies throughout the Italian campaign, as each mile forward came at the price of blood and time. Yet in 1943, the optimism of breaking into Europe through Italy overshadowed these concerns. Churchill imagined German power being stretched thin, with divisions pulled southward to defend the peninsula. The Allies, he argued, could then use Italy as a base for strikes into the Balkans or even Austria. In Churchill's mind, Italy was not the end in itself, but the key to unlocking the wider European theatre. Beyond military calculations, the political dimension of Italy's collapse was central to Allied thinking. Mussolini's regime was tottering, and the Italian people were war-weary, hungry, and disillusioned. By invading Italy, the Allies hoped not only to defeat armies, but also to ignite political upheaval that would topple fascism from within. The fall of Mussolini, they reasoned, could set off a chain reaction of surrender, rebellion, and liberation. Such an outcome would weaken Germany's grip on Europe and hasten the unravelling of the Axis alliance. Churchill was especially keen on this aspect, believing that Italy's surrender would show occupied nations that liberation was possible. For the Allies, Italy represented not just a battlefield, but a psychological front. Each step forward would send a message to Paris, Warsaw, Athens, and beyond. Germany was not invincible. By striking Mussolini's Italy, the Allies were also striking at the symbolic heart of fascism in Europe. The decision to invade Italy also had a diplomatic dimension involving Joseph Stalin. For months, the Soviet leader had demanded a second front in Western Europe, accusing the Allies of leaving the Red Army to face the full force of Germany. Stalin was skeptical of Western promises, and suspected that Britain and America might let the Soviets bleed while delaying intervention. The invasion of Sicily and then Italy offered a tangible demonstration of commitment, even if it was not the cross-channel invasion Stalin truly wanted. It allowed Roosevelt and Churchill to show that the Western Allies were engaging German forces directly in Europe. Stalin, while still impatient, recognized that the campaign tied down German divisions that might otherwise have been thrown against the Eastern Front. Thus, Italy became not only a battlefield of tanks and infantry, but also a bargaining chip in the great geopolitical game of the Allies. By choosing Italy, Churchill and Roosevelt aimed to keep Stalin's trust and maintain the fragile unity of the Grand Alliance. By mid-1943, the Mediterranean was no longer just a secondary theatre, but the focal point of Allied strategy. Sicily was targeted, Italy lay in the crosshairs, and Mussolini's dictatorship stood on the brink of collapse. Churchill's vision of the soft underbelly of Europe had prevailed, though not without debate and compromise. The Allies were poised to strike at the Axis in a way that combined military necessity, political calculation, and psychological warfare. Italy would become the next proving ground of Allied determination and cooperation. Yet, as events would soon show, The campaign would test their endurance far more than Churchill had imagined. What began as a promise of an easy breakthrough would evolve into a brutal, grinding struggle. The soft underbelly would reveal itself to be made of iron and stone, but in 1943, optimism still reigned, and the Allies prepared for their next great leap, the invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was one of the most ambitious military undertakings of World War II, blending naval, air and ground forces into a single strike. Planned as the first step in opening the Mediterranean gateway to Europe, it demanded an unprecedented level of coordination among British, American and Canadian forces. Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander, tasked with balancing political sensitivities as well as operational complexities. Under him, British General Bernard Montgomery and American General George S. Patton commanded the ground armies, each with their own style, temperament and ambitions. The plan called for landings on the southeastern coast of Sicily, the most accessible point for amphibious assault. Yet the operation was not simply a matter of ships landing troops. It required deception on a grand scale to convince the Axis that the real target lay elsewhere. The Allies feared that without such trickery, German and Italian defences could be concentrated against them. Thus, Operation Husky became not only a battle of arms, but also a battle of wits, where deception played as much a role as firepower. Planning the invasion involved staggering logistics with over 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men committed to the opening phase alone. Naval convoys had to be meticulously timed, ensuring that troops, tanks, artillery and supplies would arrive simultaneously across multiple landing beaches. The Royal Navy and the US Navy worked together to protect the convoys from Italian submarines and German aircraft, while also preparing to bombard enemy coastal defences. Airborne operations were integrated into the plan, with paratroopers and glider troops tasked with seizing key bridges and road junctions inland. This was one of the largest airborne operations ever attempted up to that point, and its success or failure would determine the tempo of the land campaign. The complexity of synchronizing land, sea and air power was immense, and even the smallest failure risked catastrophic consequences. Training exercises in North Africa and Malta drilled the troops in amphibious landings, though many soldiers remained untested in actual combat. The sense of anticipation was palpable as young men from across the Allied nations prepared for the moment that would propel them into Europe. One of the most remarkable aspects of Operation Husky was the deception plan known as Operation Mincemeat. This ingenious ruse involved planting false documents on a corpse disguised as a British officer, which was then set adrift off the coast of Spain. The documents suggested that Greece and Sardinia were the real Allied targets, luring German intelligence away from Sicily. Remarkably, the Germans accepted the bait, reinforcing defences in the Balkans while leaving Sicily comparatively underprepared. This act of deception became legendary in the annals of wartime intelligence, showcasing the creativity and daring of British spy masters. Alongside this, Allied air forces conducted sustained bombing campaigns against Sicilian airfields and ports, softening defences ahead of the invasion. The skies above the Mediterranean roared with hundreds of sorties, as bombers sought to cripple Axis logistics and limit their ability to counterattack. Every aspect of the campaign aimed to create confusion in the Axis command structure. By the time the first landing craft prepared to hit the beaches, the Germans and Italians remained uncertain of where the hammer would fall. The Allies had set the stage for a decisive strike. On the night of July 9th, 1943, the invasion began under conditions that were far from ideal. Strong winds swept across the Mediterranean, scattering airborne units and disrupting naval formations. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division were dropped across a wide area, with many landing miles from their intended drop zones. British glider troops fared even worse, with several gliders crashing into the sea before reaching Sicily. Despite these setbacks, scattered paratroopers still managed to cause havoc, ambushing enemy patrols and seizing vital crossroads. At dawn on July 10, waves of landing craft surged towards Sicily's southeastern shores. British and Canadian forces landed near Pacino, while American troops under Patton stormed ashore near Gela. Naval gunfire thundered overhead, pounding Italian coastal defences into rubble. The beaches were scenes of chaos, with men wading ashore under fire, tanks struggling through surf, and supply craft disgorging their loads into the sand. Against expectations, the landings achieved relative success, catching the defenders off guard despite the weather's interference. The defenders of Sicily, however, were far from insignificant. Italian forces, bolstered by German units from the elite Hermann Göring division, mounted fierce resistance in several sectors. At Gerla, American troops faced determined counterattacks from Italian tanks and infantry, with Patton's men fighting desperately to hold their beachhead. Offshore, US Navy cruisers and destroyers fired relentlessly, breaking up Axis formations and saving the Americans from being pushed back into the sea. Further east, Montgomery's 8th Army pressed inland, capturing Pacino and advancing towards Syracuse. The terrain of Sicily, marked by hills, vineyards, and narrow roads, favoured defenders who could dig in and ambush Allied columns. German forces quickly realised the importance of holding the island as long as possible to delay the Allied advance into Italy. As a result, every mile gained by the Allies was contested, with bitter fighting erupting in towns, fields, and mountain passes. The invasion had succeeded in landing, but the battle for Sicily was only beginning. Operation Husky was not only a test of military power but also of leadership styles. Montgomery, cautious and deliberate, favoured a methodical advance with concentrated force, ensuring that supply lines remained secure. Patton, by contrast, was aggressive, flamboyant, and eager to prove the might of the American army. Their contrasting approaches soon produced friction, with Montgomery aiming for Messina in the east, while Patton manoeuvred westward to capture Palermo. This rivalry, though tense, produced results. While Montgomery ground forward against stiff German defences, Patton's rapid movements seized vast swathes of territory. The capture of Palermo in late July gave the Allies a major port, greatly easing logistical strain. Yet even as Allied progress was impressive, German forces skillfully conducted delaying actions, using demolitions and counterattacks to slow the advance. The battle became not a swift conquest but a grinding struggle, as Axis forces sought to buy time for evacuation. In the balance hung the future of Italy itself. The air and naval dimensions of the campaign were equally decisive. Allied bombers relentlessly pounded Axis supply lines, making it difficult for German and Italian forces to reinforce or resupply their positions. Control of the sea ensured that Allied convoys could flow steadily, delivering fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Yet the Axis managed a remarkable evacuation, ferrying tens of thousands of troops across the Strait of Messina into mainland Italy under the cover of night and smoke. Despite Allied air superiority, the Germans preserved much of their fighting strength, ensuring that Italy would not be an easy conquest. Meanwhile, the toll on civilians was immense, as towns were shelled, bombed, and torn apart by the clash of armies. For the people of Sicily, the invasion brought both liberation and devastation, with families caught in the crossfire of history. Operation Husky was thus not only a military event, but a human catastrophe for the island's inhabitants. The smoke of war drifted across ancient villages, leaving scars that would endure long after the armies had moved on. By August 17, 1943, the campaign ended with the fall of Messina, the final stronghold on the island. The Allies had captured Sicily in just over a month, a remarkable achievement given the challenges of terrain, weather, and enemy resistance. The victory forced Mussolini from power, shattering fascist prestige and shaking the Axis alliance to its core. Yet the Germans had managed to withdraw substantial forces intact, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle on the Italian mainland. Operation Husky was a turning point. It marked the first Allied foothold in Europe and demonstrated the power of joint operations on a massive scale. It also revealed the bitter truth that Churchill's soft underbelly would be anything but soft. For the soldiers who fought there, Sicily was a crucible of fire, testing their endurance and forging lessons that would shape campaigns to come. The invasion was a triumph, but it was also a prologue. Ahead lay the brutal campaign for Italy itself, a campaign of mountains, rivers, and blood. By the summer of 1943, Benito Mussolini, once hailed as the father of fascism and the unshakable Duce of Italy, stood at the edge of political ruin. Years of military disasters had drained both the Italian army and the Italian people of their faith in his leadership. Defeats in Greece, humiliation in North Africa, and the staggering losses suffered on the Eastern Front shattered the myth of invincibility Mussolini had so carefully built. Ordinary Italians, once swept up in his bombastic speeches and parades, now queued for bread and questioned why their sons were dying in distant lands. Allied bombs rained upon Rome, Naples and Milan, destroying not only buildings, but also the illusion that Mussolini could protect his people. Italy was a country in despair, exhausted and divided, waiting for a breaking point. That breaking point arrived with the Allied invasion of Sicily, which laid bare Mussolini's complete inability to defend his homeland. The pressure mounted not just from the battlefield, but from within the halls of power itself. Fascism, once unyielding, was beginning to fracture. The Fascist Grand Council, a body that had long functioned as little more than Mussolini's rubber stamp, suddenly found its voice in July 19. This act was nothing short of treason within the fascist framework. But desperation overcame fear. On July 24th, in a tense and historic session, the Grand Council voted against Mussolini, with 19 in favour and only 7 against. The Duce, blindsided and humiliated, could hardly comprehend that his empire of control was unravelling in front of him. For the first time in over 2 decades, the fascist regime cracked open, revealing the weakness at its core. The coup was silent, methodical, and devastating. Mussolini's fall had begun not on the battlefield, but in the very chambers that once worshipped him. The following day, Mussolini arrived at the royal palace for his scheduled audience with King Victor Emmanuel III, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. Expecting perhaps a rebuke, or at worst a demand for reform, Mussolini was met instead with cold dismissal. The king informed him that he was relieved of his duties as prime minister, and that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would take his place. Mussolini's shock was total. The man who had dominated Italian politics for 2 decades was suddenly stripped of power in a single sentence. As he stepped outside the palace, he was quietly escorted away by police officers, not as a leader, but as a prisoner. No cheering crowds, no loyal guards, no defiant last stand, only silence and betrayal. For the Italian people, the announcement that Mussolini had been arrested was met with stunned disbelief, followed quickly by a wave of relief. The symbol of fascism had collapsed overnight, leaving a nation adrift but strangely hopeful. The reaction across Italy was electric and immediate. In cities like Milan, Florence and Rome, people tore down Mussolini's portraits, ripped apart fascist banners, and even toppled statues that had once loomed over public squares. Underground resistance groups, long suppressed by the regime, suddenly emerged into daylight, their voices growing louder with each hour. Ordinary Italians, weary of censorship and dictatorship, celebrated openly for the first time in years. Yet beneath the jubilation lay fear of what would come next. The Germans, Mussolini's supposed allies, watched the collapse with alarm and fury, recognizing that their strategic hold over Italy was slipping. For the Allies, the Duce's downfall was both a symbolic and strategic victory, confirming that Italy could be pried from the Axis grip. The fascist facade had crumbled, but the war in Italy was far from over. Mussolini's arrest marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of an even bloodier one. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the man chosen to succeed Mussolini, promised continuity even as he secretly plotted change. Publicly, he declared that Italy would continue to fight alongside Germany, assuring Hitler of loyalty. But privately, he opened back-channel negotiations with the Allies, seeking a way out of the disastrous war. Badoglio knew the peril Italy faced, its army broken, its people exhausted, and its land already under assault from the Allies in Sicily. Yet he also feared immediate German retribution if he moved too quickly. The new government walked a perilous tightrope, trapped between appeasing the Nazis and secretly preparing for surrender. This duplicity defined Italy's political crisis in the summer of 1943. While Mussolini languished in captivity, the nation stumbled forward, uncertain of its future. Italy had shed its dictator, but not yet its chains. For Mussolini himself, the fall was brutal and humiliating. Once a man who commanded armies and reshaped politics, he now found himself shuttled between safe houses, remote villas, and guarded prisons under the orders of his former subordinates. He was a prisoner of his own country, a relic of a failed ideology, hidden away so that neither his supporters nor his enemies could reach him. Mussolini's mind wrestled with betrayal by the king, by the fascist party, by the very men he had elevated to power. The Duce, who once fancied himself as a modern Caesar, was reduced to an isolated figure, stripped of dignity and command. For his enemies, this downfall was poetic justice. For his loyalists, it was an outrage, but for most Italians it was a long-awaited deliverance from a man who had led them to ruin. The Germans, however, were unwilling to accept Mussolini's downfall as final. For Hitler, the Duce's removal was both a betrayal and a dangerous precedent. If Mussolini could be toppled, what about other Axis leaders? What about Hitler himself? The Führer reacted with fury, moving swiftly to prepare military intervention in Italy. Plans were drawn up to occupy key Italian cities, secure the peninsula, and rescue Mussolini before he could be handed over to the Allies. Operation Oxa, as the plan was called, marked the beginning of Germany's takeover of Italy. What Mussolini's fall revealed was not just Italy's internal weakness, but also the ruthless determination of Nazi Germany to hold its southern front. The war in Italy would not end with Mussolini's arrest. It would in fact escalate. The collapse of fascism in July 1943 was not the end of Italy's war, but the beginning of its most painful chapter. Mussolini's arrest created a vacuum that was quickly filled by German occupation, civil war, and the brutal choices of collaboration or resistance. Italy became a battlefield, not just for armies, but for ideologies, loyalties, and survival itself. The fall of Mussolini shattered the illusion of fascist unity and exposed the fragility of dictatorships built on fear and propaganda. Yet it also gave Italians a glimmer of hope, a chance to choose a different path, however uncertain and bloody it might be. The Duce was gone, the regime was broken, and Italy stood on the threshold of transformation. But as history would prove, liberation would come at an agonizing cost. The collapse of fascism was dramatic, but the struggle for Italy's soul was only just beginning. By early September 1943, Italy stood at a crossroads, its people exhausted by war, and its leaders desperate for survival. Behind the facade of loyalty to Germany, Marshal Pietro Badoglio's government had been secretly negotiating with the Allies for weeks. The destruction of Sicily and the looming threat of an invasion of the Italian mainland forced Badoglio's hand. On September 30, representatives of the Italian government met with Allied officers in Cassibilla, Sicily, to sign a secret armistice. For Italy, the act symbolized escape, a chance to end the nightmare of fascist ambition and rejoin the civilized world. But the decision was fraught with peril, for Germany still occupied much of the peninsula and had thousands of troops already entrenched. The Italian High Command gambled that they could switch sides quickly and decisively, leaving the Germans unable to respond. Yet this gamble would unleash chaos instead of salvation. The armistice was both Italy's deliverance and its undoing. On September 8, 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower announced the armistice publicly, broadcasting the news across Europe and sending shockwaves through Italy. For millions of Italians, weary of war and bombardment, the announcement was met with joy, even relief. Families cheered, imagining that peace had at last arrived, that the long years of suffering under Mussolini were finally over. But what the Italian people did not know was that their leaders had given them no plan, no preparation, and no protection. The army scattered across the peninsula and beyond was not informed in time, leaving soldiers confused, leaderless, and abandoned. Some units threw down their weapons and surrendered to the Allies, believing the war had ended, while others were captured en masse by the Germans. In a single night, one of Europe's largest armies dissolved into chaos. The betrayal of trust by Italy's rulers was absolute, and the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The German response was swift, brutal, and meticulously planned. For weeks Hitler had suspected Italy's duplicity and had prepared Operation Axa, the plan to disarm Italian forces and occupy the peninsula. Within hours of the armistice announcement, German divisions struck with ruthless efficiency. In Rome, German troops surrounded Italian garrisons and demanded surrender at gunpoint. Across the Balkans, on the Greek islands, and in the Aegean, Italian units were overrun, their officers executed, their men shipped to labour camps. In some cases, Italian soldiers who resisted were massacred on the spot, such as the infamous slaughter of thousands on the Greek island of Cephalonia. The Germans treated their former allies not as defectors, but as traitors deserving no mercy. In northern and central Italy, tanks rolled into cities, seizing control before resistance could form. The Italian surrender had not freed the country, it had instead delivered it directly into German hands. Rome itself became a city of chaos and betrayal. Italian leaders, realizing the Germans were moving to occupy the capital, fled in panic. King Victor Emmanuel III and Marshal Badoglio abandoned Rome under the cover of night, fleeing south to Brindisi under the protection of Allied naval forces. Their departure left the Eternal City undefended and leaderless, a betrayal that stunned both civilians and soldiers alike. Ordinary Romans awoke to find their king and government gone, their city defenceless against the German onslaught. Within days, German troops occupied Rome, imposing strict control and preparing for the battles to come. The Italian monarchy, hoping to preserve itself, had saved its own skin at the expense of the people. To many Italians, the flight of their leaders was the greatest betrayal of all, a symbol of cowardice that stained the nation's honour. Rome had fallen, not to liberation, but to German domination. For Italian soldiers, the days following the armistice were a nightmare of confusion and betrayal. Many units stationed as far away as Albania, Croatia, and the Greek islands were abandoned by their commanders without orders or guidance. German troops moved in swiftly, demanding surrender, often executing officers who hesitated. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were rounded up and deported to Germany, where they were forced into labour camps under appalling conditions. These men became known as Italian military internees, stripped of both their weapons and their dignity, punished for their nation's betrayal. Others melted into the countryside, choosing to hide rather than face captivity, joining the swelling ranks of resistance fighters. The collapse of the army was not just a military defeat, it was a national humiliation, exposing the incompetence of the leadership and the staggering cost of betrayal. What should have been liberation became catastrophe. The Italian navy, however, managed to preserve some measure of honour in the chaos. When the armistice was announced, the fleet received orders to sail to Allied-controlled ports, rather than fall into German hands. In a dramatic exodus, battleships, cruisers and destroyers left their harbours, steaming south under threat of Luftwaffe attack. One battleship, the Roma, was struck by German-guided bombs and exploded, killing more than 1,200 sailors, a tragedy that underscored the peril of Italy's shifting allegiances. Yet despite losses, the majority of the fleet successfully reached Allied territory, where it was disarmed but spared destruction. For the Navy, the act symbolised loyalty to Italy itself rather than to fascism or to Germany. In contrast to the disintegration of the army, the Navy's manoeuvre provided a rare glimmer of discipline and sacrifice in an otherwise chaotic collapse. It was one of the few moments of pride in a time otherwise defined by shame. Meanwhile, the Italian civilian population faced the grim reality that surrender had not brought peace. Instead, German occupation brought repression, terror, and exploitation. Cities in northern and central Italy fell under the control of the Wehrmacht and SS, who imposed curfews, carried out arrests, and began deportations of Jews. Italians who had celebrated the armistice suddenly found themselves caught between two enemies, the occupying Germans and the returning fascists who rallied under Mussolini after his rescue. Food shortages worsened, Allied bombing raids intensified, and fear became part of daily life. For many Italians, the betrayal was twofold: betrayed by their king, who fled, and betrayed by their supposed allies, the Germans, who turned against them with savage cruelty. The hope of liberation had dissolved into the nightmare of occupation. Italy's surrender, far from ending suffering, had plunged the nation into deeper turmoil. The Armistice of Cassabile remains one of the most dramatic turning points of World War II, a moment when betrayal, chaos, and tragedy collided. Italy had sought to escape the grip of fascism and the ruin of its alliance with Germany, but the path it chose led first through disaster. Soldiers abandoned, civilians left defenceless, leaders fleeing in cowardice. The armistice exposed the fractures in Italy's national character. Yet it also marked the beginning of a new phase of the war, one in which Italy would become both battlefield and prize, torn between occupiers and liberators, collaborators and resistors. The betrayal of September 1943 ensured that the struggle for Italy would be long, bloody, and bitter. Liberation was on the horizon, but it would come only after sacrifice and suffering. The armistice promised peace, but instead it delivered Italy into the darkest chapter of its modern history. On September 9, 1943, as news of Italy's surrender reverberated across Europe, Allied troops launched one of the most daring amphibious operations of the war, Operation Avalanche. The beaches near the Italian port of Salerno were chosen as the landing site, strategically close to Naples and the road north toward Rome. At dawn, waves of American and British soldiers stormed ashore, their landing craft pushing through surf and smoke into an uncertain future. Unlike earlier landings in North Africa and Sicily, Avalanche was launched without full naval or aerial bombardment beforehand, in an attempt to preserve the element of surprise. But the Germans were waiting, their intelligence sharp, their defences primed. The landings immediately devolved into chaos, with machine gun fire cutting across the beaches and artillery raining down on the fragile invasion force. The Allies had underestimated both the ferocity of the enemy and the peril of the terrain. What began as a calculated strike quickly became a desperate battle for survival. The Germans had prepared meticulously for an Allied assault on the Italian mainland, and they were determined to throw the invaders back into the sea. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had deployed elite panzer divisions around Salerno, ready to strike once the landings began. The flat coastal plain offered little cover, while steep hills inland gave German artillery commanding positions over the beaches. As Allied soldiers scrambled ashore, German tanks rumbled forward, firing at point-blank range into the surf. Mortar shells tore through landing craft, setting some ablaze and leaving survivors struggling in the water. Units became scattered, officers were killed, and communication lines broke down within minutes of the assault. The Germans exploited every advantage, striking with precision and speed. The Salerno beaches became killing grounds, with the success of the Allied campaign hanging by a thread. What was intended as a bold thrust into Italy was rapidly turning into a nightmare. For the American Fifth Army, under the command of General Mark Clark, the first days of the landing were among the most desperate of the entire Italian campaign. Clark's men, pinned down by German fire, dug shallow trenches in the sand, and clung to the ground as shells exploded around them. Entire companies were shredded before they could reach cover, and those who did survive found themselves isolated and disoriented. The British Eighth Army, advancing from Calabria in the south, had hoped to link up quickly with Clark's forces, but the rugged mountains and German rearguards delayed their progress. This left the Americans and British at Salerno dangerously exposed, their beachhead vulnerable to counterattack. German armour repeatedly drove wedges into Allied lines, and at several points the invasion nearly collapsed. In those critical hours, survival depended not on grand strategy, but on the raw courage of soldiers holding their ground under unbearable fire. The Germans launched their most determined counterattacks between September 12 and 14, nearly breaking through the Allied beachhead. Tiger tanks spearheaded thrusts into the heart of American positions, crushing trenches beneath their treads and blasting defensive lines with high explosive shells. German infantry, well coordinated and relentless, followed close behind, exploiting every gap. In some sectors, Allied troops were forced to retreat to within a mile of the shore, with commanders fearing an evacuation might become necessary. The situation was so dire that Clark reportedly had destroyers prepared to cover a withdrawal. Yet the Allies fought with tenacity, calling in naval gunfire to pound German positions with massive shells that shook the coastline. Warships became the lifeline of the invasion, their guns breaking up armoured thrusts that otherwise might have driven the Allies back into the sea. The battle for Salerno teetered on the edge of disaster, its outcome uncertain with every passing hour. Air power also proved decisive in tipping the balance at Salerno. Allied aircraft flew countless sorties, strafing German columns and bombing assembly areas where counterattacks were forming. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, could not match the scale of Allied air superiority, and its losses mounted quickly. Yet German planes struck with lethal effect, dive-bombing landing zones and harbours, sinking supply vessels, and killing hundreds of men in sudden violent strikes. The skies over Salerno became a deadly duel, a contest of attrition fought as fiercely as the battle on the ground. For Allied soldiers pinned down by German armour, the roar of friendly fighter bombers overhead was often the only reassurance that they would survive the day. The battle was as much about maintaining supply lines and reinforcements as it was about sheer battlefield courage. Without control of the air, the fragile beachhead might have collapsed entirely. At Salerno, air supremacy was not just an advantage, it was salvation. Despite the fury of German counterattacks, the Allies gradually began to stabilise their position. Reinforcements poured ashore, including additional infantry divisions, artillery and tanks. Naval guns continued to hammer German strongpoints with devastating precision, and Allied units slowly expanded the perimeter beyond the beaches. The fighting was brutal, with villages and vineyards turning into battlegrounds where control changed hands repeatedly. Casualties mounted on both sides, with the Allies losing thousands in the first week alone. But every day that the Allies held on was a victory, for time worked in their favour. Kesselring's forces, stretched thin across Italy, could not sustain the same intensity of attack indefinitely. By mid-September, the German assaults were losing momentum, their tanks depleted, their infantry exhausted. What had begun as a precarious foothold was slowly transforming into a secure beachhead. Salerno was far from a triumph, but it was no longer on the verge of defeat. The aftermath of the battle revealed the high cost of Operation Avalanche. The Allies had suffered over 12,000 casualties, while German losses, though smaller, were strategically significant given their limited resources in Italy. The beaches at Salerno were littered with burned-out tanks, wrecked landing craft, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen in the sand. Villages lay in ruins, their homes shattered by shellfire, their fields scarred by tank treads and craters. Civilians had endured terror and destruction, caught between two armies fighting for control of their land. Yet the victory, fragile and bloody as it was, provided the Allies with a vital gateway into Italy. Naples soon fell, giving the Allies a major port, and the road north toward Rome was now open. Salerno had not been the swift breakthrough that planners had hoped for, but it had been enough to anchor the Allied advance. The beachhead had been secured at an enormous cost. Operation Avalanche remains one of the defining moments of the Italian campaign, a test of resolve that could easily have ended in disaster. The battle revealed both the vulnerability of amphibious invasions and the resilience of soldiers under impossible pressure. It demonstrated the importance of naval and air support in modern warfare, without which the Allies would surely have been overwhelmed. More than anything, it underscored the brutality of the campaign in Italy, where every mile of ground would be contested at enormous human cost. Salerno was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a long, grinding war up the spine of the peninsula. The victory came not from flawless planning or overwhelming strength, but from courage in the face of collapse. In the end, the Salerno landings were remembered not for their ease, but for their blood, their sacrifice, and their proof that the Allies could hold firm against the fury of the German counterstroke. In the wake of the bloody Salerno landings, the Allies turned their eyes northward toward Naples, the vital port city that would sustain their campaign in Italy. Without Naples, supplies would remain dependent on tenuous beachhead logistics, vulnerable to German air and artillery strikes. The city promised not just a harbour, but also a gateway to the industrial heart of southern Italy, where rail lines and roads converged into arteries leading toward Rome. Yet the path was anything but open. The German army, withdrawing with methodical discipline, had no intention of allowing a rapid Allied advance. Every bridge was primed with explosives, every road seeded with mines, every village converted into a defensive nest. The push toward Naples became less a march of liberation than a grueling crawl through an endless gauntlet of destruction. Each mile gained came at the cost of shattered vehicles, wounded soldiers, and civilians caught in the storm of war. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring executed a classic fighting withdrawal, sacrificing territory in exchange for time to regroup and reinforce the German 10th Army. The roads north from Salerno were deliberately cratered and blocked by demolitions, with retreating German engineers leaving behind twisted wreckage and impassable rubble. Bridges that had once carried commerce now lay in rivers, collapsed in heaps of stone and steel. Mines littered not only highways but also fields and orchards, forcing Allied engineers to crawl forward inch by inch, probing with bayonets to uncover hidden charges. Snipers lingered in bell towers, and machine guns raked crossroads long after main German forces had withdrawn. The retreat was not a rout, but a calculated delaying action designed to bleed the Allies and deny them momentum. For the weary soldiers pressing forward, it felt less like pursuit and more like battering against an endless series of booby-trapped fortresses. The terrain itself compounded the difficulty of the advance. Southern Italy's rugged hills, narrow roads, and stone-built villages provided natural strongpoints that German defenders exploited with ruthless efficiency. Every ridge became a defensive line, every walled farmstead a bunker. Artillery hidden in olive groves opened fire on advancing columns, then shifted positions before Allied guns could reply. Rain turned dirt roads into treacherous quagmires, bogging down trucks and tanks alike. Horses and mules, still indispensable to mountain warfare, struggled to haul supplies over mud-choked trails. Soldiers spoke of feeling trapped in a labyrinth of obstacles, where progress was measured not in miles but in yards. Each day brought relentless skirmishes, ambushes and demolitions, with the road to Naples stretching out like an unending ordeal. The geography of Italy itself seemed to conspire with the German defence, turning every valley into a killing zone. For the civilians of southern Italy, the race to Naples was a passage through hell. German troops, retreating northward, practiced a scorched earth policy, stripping villages of food, destroying wells, and requisitioning livestock. Farmers watched helplessly as their homes were torched and their crops flattened beneath the treads of tanks. Civilians attempting to flee were often trapped between two advancing armies, their carts overturned by mines, their families shattered by shellfire. In Naples itself, German forces looted warehouses, blew up docks, and prepared to leave the city in ruins. Resistance groups tried desperately to sabotage demolitions and preserve their city, but many were captured and executed. For ordinary Italians, the fall of Mussolini and the surrender to the Allies had not brought peace but a new wave of suffering. Liberation came slowly, and with it came scars that would mark entire communities for decades to come. The Allies pressed forward with growing urgency, aware that capturing Naples was essential before winter rains, and German reinforcements made further progress impossible. American and British units, though exhausted from Salerno, pushed along the coastal plain while artillery rumbled across the mountains to support them. Engineers worked day and night to clear mines, rebuild bridges, and repair roads under constant fire. Naval support from offshore ships bombarded strongpoints that resisted too stubbornly, while Allied aircraft prowled the skies to disrupt German convoys retreating north. Yet the Germans remained elusive, their rearguards striking suddenly and vanishing into the hills. What emerged was not a single battle, but a rolling campaign of attrition, with Naples as the glittering prize at the end of a blood-soaked road. The urgency was palpable, for without Naples, the Allied armies would choke on their own supply shortages before they ever reached Rome. By late September, as the Allies approached the outskirts of Naples, the Germans unleashed a final wave of destruction. Docks were rigged with explosives, ships in the harbour scuttled, and warehouses filled with supplies set ablaze. Explosions echoed across the bay as retreating units left behind nothing but rubble and fire. The city's aqueduct was dynamited, cutting off water to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Electricity failed as power stations were demolished, leaving Naples in darkness even before the Allies arrived. In their desperation, the Germans hoped to leave the port useless for months, perhaps years, denying the Allies the vital hub they so desperately needed. The destruction was systematic and brutal, a clear reminder that this was not a war of liberation in the abstract, but a battle over every stone and street of Italy's tortured land. Inside Naples, the people themselves rose up in defiance. Known as the 4 Days of Naples, the uprising saw ordinary civilians, students, and even children take to the streets against the retreating German forces. Armed with little more than rifles, knives, and Molotov cocktails, they ambushed convoys, sabotaged explosives, and seized control of key intersections. Women carried messages, boys hurled stones, and families hid partisans in their homes. German reprisals were brutal, with executions carried out in public squares, but the revolt did not falter. By the time Allied troops entered the city on October 1st, 1943, Naples had already begun to liberate itself. The defiance of its people became a symbol of Italian resistance, a moment when a city refused to die quietly under foreign occupation. In the smoke and rubble of Naples, courage shone amid the ruins. The capture of Naples transformed the Allied campaign in Italy. Despite the devastation, engineers quickly restored the harbour, allowing vast quantities of supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to flow in. The city became the lifeline of the Allied advance, feeding the armies that would struggle up the spine of Italy in the months to come. Yet the victory was bittersweet, for the destruction revealed the ferocity of the German retreat and the price the civilian population had paid. Naples was scarred but unbroken, its survival testament to both Allied determination and local resilience. For the soldiers who had fought their way north, it was a hard-earned triumph, a moment of relief after weeks of attrition and terror. But beyond Naples lay the mountains, rivers and strongholds of central Italy, where Kesselring's forces prepared their next line of defence. The race to Naples had been won, but the war for Italy was only beginning. As the Allies celebrated the capture of Naples, their gaze shifted northward, where the Apennine Mountains loomed like a wall across the Italian peninsula. The Germans, under the brilliant defensive mind of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had no intention of abandoning Italy without extracting a heavy price. In this rugged terrain, they began constructing a system of defences unlike anything the Allies had faced so far. This line would not be a single trench or barricade, but a layered fortress of bunkers, artillery emplacements, and camouflaged strongholds stretching across the width of Italy. Known as the Winter Line, it represented the German determination to bleed the Allies in every valley and on every ridge. Its purpose was not merely to delay, but to exhaust the invaders, grinding down their strength before they could reach Rome. The Apennines, with their steep slopes and narrow passes, provided the natural skeleton of this defence. Into this geography, German engineers poured their ingenuity, cementing the mountains into a fortress. The Winter Line was in fact 3 separate defensive systems, the Gustav Line, the Bernhardt Line and the Hitler Line, each designed to support the other. The Gustav Line formed the backbone, running from the Tyrrhenian coast through the mountains to the Adriatic Sea. Anchored on rivers and ridges, it was reinforced with minefields, barbed wire and concrete bunkers. The Bernhardt Line lay forward of it, a delaying position meant to slow Allied momentum with ambushes and strongpoints. The Hitler Line, further north, provided a fallback should the Gustav Line be breached. Together they created a depth of defence that forced the Allies to fight not one battle, but a succession of battles across successive barriers. For the Germans, this system promised to buy months of time. For the Allies, it signalled that the road to Rome would not be swift or cheap. The Winter Line was not just a defence, it was a calculated strategy of attrition. German engineers worked with relentless precision, using Italy's landscape as their greatest weapon. Roads were blasted away, tunnels collapsed and bridges destroyed, ensuring that Allied vehicles would struggle to advance. In the mountains, entire ridges were transformed into natural bastions with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests were hidden in stone walls, while artillery batteries were dug into caves that shielded them from air attack. Villages perched on high ground were fortified, their church towers converted into observation posts. Mines were sown across roads, fields, and riverbanks in staggering numbers, creating invisible death traps for advancing troops. Camouflage concealed bunkers beneath vineyards and orchards, making them nearly invisible until they erupted with fire. To assault such defences meant advancing through terrain already designed to kill, against defenders who had mastered the art of delay. The winter line became an extension of the land itself, unyielding, deceptive, and lethal. The strategic centrepiece of the winter line was the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. Sitting atop a towering hill that dominated the Liri Valley, the abbey commanded the main route to Rome, the Via Casalina. Its position made it both a natural stronghold and a symbol of cultural heritage, presenting the Allies with a moral and tactical dilemma. For the Germans, it became a keystone of the Gustav Line, with artillery batteries positioned in the surrounding hills and defensive positions woven into the valleys below. From its height, observers could direct devastating fire on any Allied advance. For the Allies, the question lingered: could they assault such a sacred site without destroying it? The monastery thus became not only a military challenge, but also a symbol of the clash between strategy, culture, and the brutality of total war. The fate of Monte Cassino would soon epitomize the struggle for Italy itself. Life on the winter line was brutal for both sides. German soldiers, though skilled in defensive warfare, endured constant bombardment, cold rain, and shortages of supplies as winter set in. Dug into bunkers and caves, they lived like moles, emerging only to repel Allied assaults before retreating into the shadows. The Allies, for their part, faced the grinding task of scaling mountains under fire, dragging artillery through mud, and fighting in conditions that resembled the trenches of the First World War. Rain turned valleys into rivers of muck, and snow blanketed the ridges, freezing both men and machinery. Casualties mounted, not only from combat but from exposure, disease, and exhaustion. Soldiers on both sides came to see the winter line not as a battle, but as a slow crucifixion, a drawn-out ordeal in which progress was measured in yards, bought with blood and suffering. Kesselring's defensive strategy was not merely about holding lines, but about exploiting time. He understood that every day the Allies spent bogged down in Italy was a day the Eastern Front and Western Front could stabilise. By forcing the Allies into a slow, grinding battle, he hoped to draw off divisions that might otherwise invade France. The winter line was thus a delaying shield for the Greater Reich, an investment of manpower in exchange for precious months. And Kesselring's troops carried out his vision, with determination, conducting counterattacks that kept the Allies off balance. Even when forced back, they retreated in good order, always leaving behind obstacles to slow pursuit. The winter line, therefore, was not just geography and concrete, it was a philosophy of resistance, a way of war designed to make every Allied step forward feel like defeat. For the Allied commanders, the winter line posed agonizing choices. Should they attempt frontal assaults on fortified positions, risking catastrophic losses, or should they seek flanking maneuvers across mountains where tanks could not go? Air power, though overwhelming, struggled to neutralize German defenses hidden in caves and forests. Naval bombardment could not reach the high ridges inland. As a result, the Allies often had no choice but to send infantry directly against positions bristling with machine guns and mortars. Commanders weighed lives against ground gained, knowing each order condemned hundreds of men to climb into fire-swept slopes. The winter line thus became not only a tactical challenge but a moral one, as leaders faced the cruel arithmetic of attrition. In its brutal calculus, the mountains of Italy consumed divisions as surely as any battlefield in Europe. By the end of 1943, the winter line stood as a fortress in every sense: geographical, military, and psychological. The Allies had advanced hundreds of miles since Sicily, yet now found themselves halted by a wall of steel and stone. Soldiers who had imagined a rapid march to Rome realized they were instead trapped in a campaign of endurance. For civilians caught in the crossfire, The winter line meant shattered homes, ruined harvests, and the terror of living between two armies. For the Germans it became a point of pride, proof that they could hold against overwhelming odds. And for the Allies it was a bitter lesson. Italy would not be conquered by speed or manoeuvre, but by grinding persistence. The winter line was not merely a battlefield, it was a crucible, shaping the destiny of the Italian campaign and foreshadowing the bloody months still to come. Rising high above the Liri Valley, the monastery of Monte Cassino seemed both timeless and untouchable, its ancient stone walls glowing against the Italian sun. Founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, it had survived centuries of invasions, earthquakes, and wars, becoming a symbol of European spiritual heritage. Yet in 1943, its location transformed it from a place of prayer into the focal point of a brutal military campaign. From its commanding height, the abbey overlooked the road to Rome, the Via Casalina, and thus dominated the main corridor through the Gustav Line. German forces entrenched around its base and in the surrounding ridges, turning the valley below into a deadly fortress of minefields, artillery, and hidden strongpoints. For the Allies, Monte Cassino became the key that had to be taken if Rome was to be reached. But every soldier who looked up at the monastery knew it would be a battle unlike any other. The Gustav Line itself was not a single wall, but a network of defences designed to funnel attackers into narrow valleys where they could be annihilated. Rivers swelled with winter rains, turning crossings into mud-choked traps. Hillsides were riddled with bunkers and interlocking machine gun nests, while the slopes themselves acted as natural barriers against tanks and heavy equipment. The Rapido River, flowing at the foot of the Monte Cassino Massif, became a formidable obstacle that had to be crossed under the full view of German artillery. Allied reconnaissance revealed the complexity of the defences, but maps could not capture the terror of advancing into terrain, sculpted for death. Each inch forward would mean storming against a fortress that combined nature, history, and German engineering. The Gustav Line was not merely defended, it was weaponized, and Monte Cassino stood as its heart. For the Allies, the strategic importance of Monte Cassino was matched by its psychological weight. Breaking through here meant piercing the German shield that had stalled their advance since Naples. Yet commanders faced a dilemma. Was the monastery itself being used as a German stronghold? The Germans claimed they had respected its sanctity, stationing no troops within its walls, though observers in Allied lines insisted that artillery spotting came from the abbey. Reports were conflicting, and rumours spread quickly, creating a cloud of uncertainty. But regardless of whether German troops occupied the monastery, its sheer position made it an anchor of resistance. Allied troops felt that as long as the abbey stood, their advance would falter. Thus Monte Cassino became not just a military objective, but a psychological one, a towering reminder that victory in Italy demanded unimaginable sacrifice. The first Allied assault on Monte Cassino began in January 1944, with the American II Corps tasked with breaking the Gustav Line. The plan called for a crossing of the Rapido River, one of the most dangerous undertakings of the Italian campaign. Under heavy rain and in icy conditions, American engineers attempted to build pontoon bridges, while German artillery and mortars rained destruction upon them. Infantry struggled across in rubber boats, many of which capsized under fire, sending men into the freezing current, where they drowned before reaching the far shore. Those who made it across found themselves pinned down in open fields, unable to advance against entrenched German positions. The operation ended in disaster, with horrific casualties and little ground gained. The Rapido crossing would become a symbol of Allied sacrifice, remembered by survivors as a nightmare of mud, blood, and futility. While the Americans bled along the Rapido, British and Indian forces launched probing attacks against the heights surrounding Cassino. The Gurkhas, famed for their mountain fighting skills, attempted daring climbs up treacherous slopes under cover of darkness. But German paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger, held the ridges with unyielding ferocity, turning every rock and crevice into a fortress. Mortars and machine guns raked the slopes, cutting down attackers before they could close the distance. Even when small groups reached German lines, they faced savage hand-to-hand combat in the frozen night. The Allies discovered that taking ground around Cassino was an act of sheer endurance, requiring men to fight not only the enemy, but also the punishing cold and exhaustion of mountain warfare. Despite repeated assaults, the lines barely shifted, and German resolve only hardened. As the first battle dragged on, Allied commanders realized that their plans had underestimated the depth of German defenses. Communication broke down in the rugged terrain, artillery support often fell short or overshot, and reinforcements struggled to reach the front through cratered roads and mined pathways. Soldiers described the battlefield as a labyrinth of destruction, where every movement forward triggered hidden explosives or a sudden burst of fire. Supplies had to be hauled by mule or carried on men's backs, adding to the exhaustion. The Germans, by contrast, used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to conduct swift counterattacks, slipping through ravines to strike at Allied flanks. The battlefield became a test of endurance where progress was measured in yards and losses in thousands. It became increasingly clear that this was not a battle that could be won quickly. For the soldiers on the ground, Monte Cassino became a vision of hell. The valley reeked of death, filled with shattered trees, scorched villages, and the cries of the wounded echoing off the slopes. Machine guns rattled endlessly, mortars screamed overhead, and the ground shook under the weight of artillery barrages. Men dug shallow foxholes into rocky soil, praying for cover that never seemed enough. Rain turned the earth into rivers of mud, soaking uniforms and weapons until everything was heavy and useless. Hunger gnawed at the troops, while fatigue left them staggering like sleepwalkers into battle. Letters from home described distant comforts, but here, in the shadow of Monte Cassino, time seemed frozen in misery. Each failed assault left the soldiers bitter and broken, convinced they were fighting a mountain itself rather than an enemy. By February 1944, the first Allied attempts to take Monte Cassino had ended in bloody stalemate. Thousands lay dead or wounded, while the monastery still stood untouched above the valley, serene yet ominous. German defenders had proven unshakable, and Allied morale sagged under the weight of repeated failure. Yet commanders refused to abandon the offensive, convinced that Monte Cassino remained the gateway to Rome. Plans were already forming for a renewed assault, one that would unleash even greater firepower against the Gustav Line. The First Battle of Monte Cassino had demonstrated the immense difficulty of storming this mountain fortress, but it had also set the stage for one of the most controversial decisions of the war. For the Abbey, the coming weeks would bring destruction that would echo far beyond Italy, turning a sacred place into a symbol of the war's merciless logic. By early February 1944, Allied commanders had reached a grim conclusion. The Abbey of Monte Cassino itself must be destroyed. For weeks, debates raged within the command staff over whether German troops were using the monastery as a defensive position. While the Germans insisted they respected the sanctity of the site, Allied patrols swore they saw movement and spotting from the ancient walls. General Mark Clark of the US Fifth Army and others felt that as long as the Abbey stood, it cast a psychological shadow over Allied troops, who believed it was an invulnerable fortress. The decision was made with reluctance and controversy to unleash air power upon a building that had stood for nearly 1,400 years. It was a moment where history, faith, and warfare collided in a single devastating choice. On February 15, 1944, the sky above Monte Cassino filled with the roar of Allied bombers. Over 200 aircraft, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, and B-26 Marauders, droned into formation, carrying their deadly cargo. Monks, civilians, and refugees inside the abbey huddled in fear as the air vibrated with approaching destruction. At 9:30 in the morning, the first bombs fell, shaking the mountain to its core. The ancient monastery cracked and collapsed under the rain of explosives, sending walls crumbling into heaps of stone. For 3 hours, wave after wave of bombers obliterated the abbey, reducing it to a skeletal ruin visible for miles. By noon, the monastery that had endured centuries of invasions and storms lay in rubble, its legacy shattered in a single morning of fire and fury. The aftermath of the bombing left a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The hilltop was transformed into a jagged landscape of stone, smoke, and dust, where sacred frescoes and ancient manuscripts were buried under tons of debris. Survivors staggered from the ruins, dazed and terrified, including monks and civilians who had sought shelter within. The Allies hoped the destruction would strip the Germans of a key vantage point, but the opposite occurred. The rubble provided the perfect stronghold for the Fallschirmjäger, who quickly occupied the shattered remains. Where once there had been open walls, there were now labyrinths of cover, sniper nests, and concealed firing positions. The decision to bomb the abbey would remain one of the most controversial of the entire war, fueling debates about necessity and morality that still echo today. Following the bombing, Allied ground forces launched assaults to seize the ruins. Indian and New Zealand divisions were tasked with storming the shattered heights, fighting through clouds of dust and twisted masonry. The Gurkhas attempted daring night climbs up sheer cliffs, scaling paths where a single misstep meant death. Meanwhile, New Zealand infantry pressed through the valley, only to be met with relentless German fire from newly fortified positions among the rubble. Artillery shells pounded the slopes, and machine guns turned open ground into killing fields. Men fought hand-to-hand in the monastery's remains, trading grenades and bayonet thrusts among broken stones that had once been altars and chapels. The abbey, once a place of peace, had become a fortress of carnage, where progress was measured in inches and lives lost. The multinational nature of the battle added to its intensity and complexity. Alongside the British and New Zealanders fought Indian troops, including Rajputana rifles and Gurkhas, whose bravery in the face of impossible odds became legendary. Moroccan Goumiers, part of the French Expeditionary Corps, struck into the rugged mountains, using their knowledge of guerrilla-style tactics to infiltrate German lines. American units remained engaged on the flanks, while Polish forces prepared for their own role in the final assaults to come. The battlefield became a convergence of nations, each bringing its own traditions, languages, and methods of fighting. Yet despite their differences, they were united by the same brutal reality. The Gustav line could only be broken through relentless sacrifice. Monte Cassino was now not just a battle for Italy, but a global struggle fought on a sacred mountain. German defenders, particularly the paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, fought with extraordinary determination. Trained in elite tactics, they transformed every pile of rubble into a deadly ambush point. Snipers eliminated officers and radio operators, while machine gunners swept advancing units with devastating precision. Mortars rained down on assembly areas, and counterattacks struck swiftly, often at night when the Allies were most vulnerable. The Germans knew they could not retreat. Monte Cassino was essential to holding the Gustav line. Their discipline and skill forced the Allies to pay dearly for every yard of ground, and captured Allied soldiers later admitted a grudging respect for the defenders' tenacity. For the Fallschirmjäger, Monte Cassino became a battle of honour and survival, fought to the last man amid the ruins of history. The human toll of the second battle for Monte Cassino was staggering. Casualties mounted into the thousands, with men killed, maimed, or left permanently scarred by the horrors of the fighting. Medical stations overflowed with wounded, many of whom were carried down treacherous mountain paths under constant fire. The destruction of the abbey haunted soldiers on both sides, with some Allied troops openly questioning whether the bombing had been a mistake. Civilians caught between the lines suffered unimaginable hardship, their homes destroyed and families shattered. The monks who survived the bombing carried with them grief for their lost heritage, watching as sacred ground became a battlefield of death. Every soldier who fought at Cassino knew they were part of a tragedy as much as a military campaign, a clash where victory seemed almost indistinguishable from loss. By March 1944, the second battle for Monte Cassino had ended, in another stalemate. The abbey lay in ruins, the valley scarred by relentless bombardment, and the Allies exhausted from repeated failures. German defences remained intact, and the Gustav line still held firm across Italy. Yet the struggle was not over. Commanders prepared for renewed offensives, determined to break the stalemate no matter the cost. Monte Cassino had already consumed thousands of lives and centuries of history, but it had not yet yielded its grip on the road to Rome. The ruins of the abbey stood as both a symbol and a fortress, embodying the futility and ferocity of the Italian campaign. Ahead lay even more brutal battles, where nations would throw their full strength against a mountain that seemed unbreakable. The worst, in truth, was still to come. In January 1944, as the battles at Monte Cassino dragged into stalemate, Allied commanders conceived a bold plan to break the deadlock. Codenamed Operation Shingle, it called for an amphibious landing behind German lines at the small coastal town of Anzio, just 30 miles from Rome. The idea was simple yet daring: bypass the formidable Gustav Line entirely, threaten the German rear, and force them to abandon their mountain defences. Winston Churchill, always fond of audacious manoeuvres, championed the plan with his characteristic zeal, calling it a chance to hurl a wildcat into the back door. American General John P. Lucas was chosen to command the landing force, though his cautious temperament soon clashed with the bold spirit of the operation. The troops assigned included the US. For the men preparing to storm Anzio, the mission carried the promise of ending the bloody stalemate in Italy. Yet beneath the optimism lay uncertainties, for success would hinge not only on surprise, but on speed and relentless aggression once ashore. The morning of January 20th, 1944, dawned cold and misty along the Italian coast. Before sunrise, Allied landing craft surged toward the beaches, carrying more than 36,000 men and thousands of tons of equipment. Unlike the carnage of Normandy months later, the landings at Anzio were almost eerily unopposed. German defences in the immediate area were thin, as Kesselring had concentrated his forces along the Gustav Line, leaving the coast vulnerable. Troops stormed ashore with minimal resistance, quickly securing the beaches and pushing inland to seize the town of Anzio and neighbouring Nettuno. By nightfall, the Allies had achieved a near-flawless amphibious landing, surprising even themselves at the ease of their initial success. Sherman tanks rumbled off landing craft, artillery was established, and supply lines began flowing almost immediately. Churchill and Allied leaders celebrated, convinced that the road to Rome might finally be open. But instead of exploiting this breakthrough, hesitation crept into the operation at the most critical moment. General Lucas, mindful of his limited forces and wary of German counterattacks, chose to consolidate the beachhead rather than launch an immediate drive inland. Engineers built defences, supply dumps were fortified, and infantry dug trenches as if preparing for a siege rather than a lightning advance. To some commanders, this caution seemed prudent. To others, it was a squandered opportunity of historic proportions. The German High Command, stunned by the landing, reacted with extraordinary speed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring immediately redirected divisions from central Italy, racing reinforcements toward the Anzio plain. Within days, crack German units, including panzer divisions, were converging on the beachhead from north and south. What had begun as an Allied masterstroke was rapidly transforming into a dangerous trap. The pause that Lucas insisted upon allowed the Germans to prepare, and soon the Allies would find themselves under siege in the very territory they had come to conquer. By early February, the Allies at Anzio were facing the grim reality of encirclement. German artillery took up positions in the surrounding Alban hills, giving them commanding views of the beachhead. The flat coastal plain offered little natural cover, leaving Allied soldiers vulnerable to constant shelling. German gunners unleashed such relentless bombardments that troops nicknamed the area Hell's Half Acre, while Anzio harbour became infamous as Anzio Annie, thundered shells from a massive railway gun. Every movement inland was met with withering fire, and patrols returning to camp spoke of German defences growing stronger by the day. The beachhead, once a symbol of daring, now resembled a trap, with Allied divisions hunkered in foxholes as though awaiting annihilation. Supply convoys braved Luftwaffe raids, while medics worked tirelessly to treat the mounting casualties. For the men on the ground, Anzio became less a gamble for victory, and more a fight for survival. The battle at Anzio soon escalated into a grinding stalemate of extraordinary brutality. German counterattacks struck with ferocious intensity, seeking to drive the Allies back into the sea. Waves of infantry and armour assaulted the perimeter, forcing desperate defensive battles along every sector. American Rangers clashed with seasoned German troops in bloody hand-to-hand combat amid drainage ditches and farmhouses. British divisions, hardened by earlier campaigns, held firm under the weight of artillery and mortars that shattered the landscape into a lunar wasteland. Casualties climbed by the thousands, with stretcher-bearers often trudging through mud under fire to retrieve the wounded. Trenches flooded with winter rain, turning dugouts into quagmires of misery, while rats and disease compounded the suffering. Both sides fought with unyielding determination, knowing that the outcome at Anzio would shape the entire Italian campaign. It was no longer an amphibious raid, it had become a siege in all but name. For weeks the Allies clung desperately to their beachhead, enduring repeated German offensives that threatened to crush them. At Cisterna, the US Rangers launched a daring but ill-fated attack, advancing deep into enemy lines only to be surrounded and annihilated. Out of more than 700 men, only a handful escaped, the rest killed or captured in one of the most tragic episodes of the campaign. Elsewhere, armoured clashes erupted across the plain, as Shermans and German Panthers duelled at close range in fields scarred with shell holes. The Luftwaffe struck whenever weather permitted, strafing supply depots and convoys, while Allied air forces retaliated in the skies above. Amid the carnage, hospitals overflowed, their tents illuminated at night by the glow of surgery lamps working tirelessly to save shattered lives. General Lucas, criticised for his caution, was eventually relieved of command, replaced by the more aggressive General Lucian Truscott. Yet by then, the gamble at Anzio had devolved into a costly war of attrition. Life in the Anzio beachhead became a test of endurance as much as combat. Soldiers lived in trenches and foxholes under constant threat of shell fire, never knowing when the next bombardment would strike. Supplies arrived steadily, but the monotony of canned rations and the cold of the Italian winter wore down morale. Letters from home reminded troops of the normal lives they had left behind, a stark contrast to the mud and terror of their daily existence. Chaplains conducted services under fire, offering words of comfort in fields littered with destruction. Engineers laboured tirelessly to maintain supply lines through the harbour, even as German shells disrupted unloading operations. Despite the misery, camaraderie bound the men together, with shared hardship forging bonds that transcended nationality. British, American and Canadian troops shared cigarettes, stories and laughter amid the chaos, reminding themselves of why they fought. The beachhead was a crucible, forging resilience from despair. By late spring of 1944, the Anzio stalemate began to shift as broader Allied offensives gained momentum. Reinforcements poured into the beachhead, swelling the Allied presence to over 150,000 troops. Coordinated with renewed attacks on the Gustav Line, the Allies prepared for a breakout that would finally achieve the original goal of Operation Shingle. In May, the combined might of American, British and French forces surged forward, overwhelming German positions with sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The breakout drove through the Alban Hills, cutting German supply lines and forcing a retreat toward Rome. Yet the cost of reaching this point was staggering. More than 70,000 Allied casualties and an equal toll on the Germans. What had begun as a daring gamble ended as a bloody ordeal, remembered less for its promise than for its suffering. The Anzio beachhead, carved in blood and sacrifice, stood as both a lesson in missed opportunities and a testament to human endurance in the face of relentless war. By the spring of 1944, the battle for Cassino had stretched on for months, a grinding contest of willpower and blood that seemed to defy resolution. The monastery, reduced to ruins after the Allied bombing, now served as a fortified German bastion, each shattered wall concealing nests of machine guns and snipers. Allied commanders, determined to crack the Gustav Line once and for all, planned a final series of assaults that would dwarf everything that had come before. Fresh troops, including Polish, French and Indian divisions, were brought into the line, joining exhausted American, British and New Zealand units. French General Alphonse June argued passionately for a flanking movement through the Aranci Mountains, a route many deemed impassable, but which his Moroccan Goumier could navigate with ease. The plan, bold in its conception, promised to turn the German defences from the rear rather than batter them head-on. This final offensive, codenamed Operation Diadem, would unleash the combined weight of 4 armies along a 100-mile front. As the orders went out, soldiers steeled themselves for what all understood would be one of the most decisive battles of the Italian campaign. On May 11th, 1944, at precisely 11 p.m, the night sky above Cassino erupted with thunder as more than 1,600 Allied guns opened fire in a synchronized barrage. For hours the mountains trembled under the pounding of shells, flashes lighting up the darkness as though the heavens themselves were aflame. Infantry units advanced under cover of the artillery storm, wading through smoke and debris into a labyrinth of minefields and barbed wire. German paratroopers, seasoned veterans of countless battles, fought back with a ferocity that shocked even hardened soldiers. Machine guns rattled from ruined walls, mortars burst among advancing columns, and flamethrowers spewed death into narrow alleys. The first waves paid a terrible price, but the pressure did not relent, as reinforcements surged forward to replace the fallen. Across the front, every sector became a cauldron of chaos, from the Rapido river crossings to the slopes of Monte Cassino itself. The scale of destruction and the intensity of resistance revealed the full cost of breaching the Gustav Line. Yet for the Allies, retreat was no longer an option. Victory at Cassino was essential to advancing toward Rome. Perhaps the most daring manoeuvre of Operation Diadem unfolded in the Abruzzi Mountains, where General Juin's French Expeditionary Corps executed a plan many had dismissed as impossible. His Moroccan Goumiers, mountain warriors skilled in navigating rugged terrain, scaled sheer cliffs and traversed narrow ridges under cover of night. Carrying their weapons and supplies on mules, they bypassed German strongpoints that had defied months of frontal assaults. Emerging suddenly behind enemy lines, they struck with shocking speed, overrunning positions that had once seemed untouchable. The Germans, unprepared for an attack through such inhospitable terrain, reeled under the unexpected pressure. Entire companies surrendered, while others fled in confusion as French colonial troops swept down upon them. This breakthrough not only destabilized the Gustav Line, but also opened paths for armoured divisions to advance. Juin's audacity had paid off, demonstrating how unconventional tactics could succeed where sheer force had failed. The Abruzzi manoeuvre was hailed as one of the most brilliant strokes of the Italian campaign. At Monte Cassino itself, the Polish II Corps carried the heavy burden of the final assault. These soldiers, many of whom had endured Soviet gulags and exile before joining the Allied cause, saw Cassino not only as a strategic objective, but as a symbol of redemption. Beginning on May 17th, Polish infantry climbed the shattered slopes under relentless German fire, advancing yard by yard through rubble and craters. The ruins of the abbey became a fortress of death, with every stone concealing danger. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed, yet the Poles pressed forward, driven by duty and the memory of their homeland under Nazi occupation. After days of savage fighting, their flag finally rose above the ruins on May 18th, signalling the end of the monastery's ordeal. The capture of Cassino came at a staggering cost, with thousands of Polish soldiers killed or wounded in the assault. Yet their sacrifice was immortalized, their victory carved into history as both a military triumph and a testament to resilience against impossible odds. With Cassino fallen and the Gustav Line breached, the road to Rome lay open at last. German forces, though still formidable, were now in retreat, withdrawing to secondary positions further north. The Allies seized the momentum, pouring divisions through the gaps and racing across the Liri Valley. Bridges were rebuilt at lightning speed, armoured columns surged forward, and supply lines stretched to keep pace with the rapid advance. Villages long trapped under occupation were liberated one after another, their weary inhabitants greeting Allied soldiers with joy and relief. Yet the retreating Germans left behind fields sown with mines, booby traps and scorched earth, ensuring that every mile was still contested. Allied engineers worked around the clock to clear hazards, allowing the advance to continue without pause. For the men who had endured months of bitter stalemate, the sudden progress felt exhilarating, Though the shadow of further battles loomed ahead, the Italian campaign had entered a new, decisive phase. Meanwhile, at Anzio, where Allied troops had been trapped in a bloody stalemate since January, the German retreat from Cassino created an opportunity. Reinforced and reinvigorated, the Anzio force broke out of the beachhead with renewed determination, advancing into the Alban Hills to cut off the German 10th Army. Heavy clashes erupted as German divisions fought desperately to avoid encirclement, but the Allied pincer was closing fast. Tanks rolled through farmland, artillery shattered enemy rearguards, and infantry pressed forward with a sense of long-awaited release. At Cisterna and Velletri, the fighting reached a fever pitch, with German units sacrificing themselves to delay the Allied pursuit. Though the encirclement was not fully achieved, the pressure forced the Germans into a rapid withdrawal northward. For the soldiers at Anzio, the breakout was vindication, transforming months of misery into a decisive contribution to victory. Combined with the Cassino breakthrough, it ensured that the march on Rome could not be stopped. On June 4, 1944, the first Allied patrols entered the Eternal City. Rome, the heart of Italy, a city of ancient empires and Renaissance splendour, had endured occupation for nearly 9 months under German control. Now its liberation marked both a symbolic and strategic triumph. Crowds of Italians filled the streets, cheering, weeping, and offering flowers to the advancing troops. American tanks rolled past the Colosseum, while British and Canadian infantry marched through piazzas that had witnessed centuries of history. For many Romans, liberation meant the end of fear and hunger, though the scars of occupation would remain for years. Pope Pius XII remained neutral, but expressed relief at the end of violence within the Holy City. For the Allies, the capture of Rome was a milestone, but its timing was bittersweet. Only 2 days later, on June 6, the world's attention would shift to Normandy, overshadowing the sacrifices that had brought victory in Italy. Yet for those who fought their way through Cassino, Anzio, and the valleys of central Italy, the liberation of Rome was a triumph earned in blood. The cost of the Cassino breakthrough and the liberation of Rome was staggering. Over 55,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded during the campaign, while German losses were equally severe. The destruction of Monte Cassino left one of Europe's most historic monasteries in ruins, a haunting reminder of the price of modern warfare. Entire villages had been levelled, their populations displaced, while the countryside bore scars that would take decades to heal. Yet amid the devastation, the campaign achieved its goals. The Gustav Line was broken, Rome was liberated, and the German grip on Italy was irreparably weakened. The victories of May and June 1944 revealed both the horrors and the heroism of war, acts of cruelty alongside moments of extraordinary sacrifice. Soldiers who had endured the nightmare of Cassino and the stalemate of Anzio now marched into Rome as liberators, carrying with them memories that would never fade. The Italian campaign, long overshadowed, stood as one of the most grueling and costly paths to Allied victory. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had liberated Rome, but their path northward was far from open. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was a master of defensive warfare, renowned for turning rugged terrain into impregnable fortresses. Anticipating the Allied advance, he prepared his next great line of resistance, stretching across the narrowest point of the Italian peninsula between the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic seas. This formidable system, known as the Gothic Line, extended for nearly 200 miles, embedded deep within the Apennine Mountains. Constructed with concrete bunkers, steel gun emplacements, and interlocking fields of fire, it was designed to make every valley a death trap. The line exploited Italy's natural geography, sheer ridges, river valleys, and mountain passes, to magnify the power of relatively small German forces. Kesselring's engineers, aided by forced Italian labour, reinforced cliffs, mined approaches, and transformed caves into hidden firing positions. Unlike the Gustav Line, which had relied heavily on static defences, the Gothic Line was flexible, layered, and ready to absorb relentless assaults. For the Allies, it promised another gruelling campaign in terrain that favoured the defender. The Allies, flush with their victory at Rome, believed they could push through northern Italy before the year's end. Optimism ran high in the summer of 1944, with General Harold Alexander's allied armies of Italy preparing Operation Olive, the grand offensive to smash the Gothic line. The plan called for a two-pronged assault. The British 8th Army would strike along the Adriatic coast, while the American 5th Army advanced through the central Apennines toward Bologna. The strategy aimed to split German forces, forcing them to defend two separate fronts, and opening a pathway into the fertile Po Valley beyond. Allied commanders hoped that success in Italy could accelerate Germany's collapse, supporting the broader Allied offensives in France after D-Day. Yet Kesselring's careful planning and mastery of Italy's unforgiving terrain had created a defensive shield that far exceeded expectations. What lay ahead would prove that optimism premature, as each ridge, river and village became another barrier drenched in blood. On August 25, 1944, Operation Olive began with thunderous artillery barrages along the Adriatic sector. The British 8th Army, bolstered by Canadian, Polish and Indian divisions, surged forward into the Gothic line's eastern defences. Initial progress was encouraging, as Allied infantry overwhelmed outposts and captured forward trenches, but as they advanced deeper, the full strength of Kesselring's defences emerged. German troops dug into caves and bunkers carved into mountainsides, unleashed withering fire that stalled advances. Mortars rained down on exposed attackers, while mines and booby traps claimed countless casualties. The rugged hills magnified the difficulties as tanks struggled to climb narrow roads and infantry were forced into brutal close-quarters fighting. Entire battalions were reduced to shadows of their former strength, yet the 8th Army pressed on relentlessly. For every village liberated, dozens of men fell, their sacrifice buying only a few miles of blood-soaked ground. The Gothic line was proving itself one of the most formidable barriers of the war. Meanwhile, the American 5th Army, under General Mark Clark, advanced in the central Apennines, striking toward Florence and Bologna. Their path was no less treacherous, as German forces transformed mountain passes into killing zones. Heavy rains turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, bogging down vehicles and limiting supply lines. Infantry units carried ammunition and supplies on their backs, climbing steep slopes under constant fire. German artillery positioned on commanding ridges poured shells onto advancing columns with deadly precision. Villages perched on hilltops became fortresses, defended by machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The Americans, supported by Brazilian and South African contingents, fought uphill in battle after battle, enduring staggering losses. Each advance was measured not in miles but in yards, with every stream crossing and ridge captured at a terrible price. Despite overwhelming Allied air superiority, the mountains shielded German positions from bombardment. Clark's men learned quickly that the Gothic line was not a single line, but a vast defensive region that demanded unrelenting effort to penetrate. Kesselring's defensive genius lay not only in the physical strength of the Gothic line, but in his ability to orchestrate elastic resistance. When pressure grew overwhelming in one sector, he ordered controlled withdrawals to secondary positions, bleeding the Allies while preserving his forces. This strategy forced Allied commanders to commit more troops, more artillery, and more time for every breakthrough attempt. Even when positions were abandoned, German rearguards fought tenaciously, ambushing pursuers, and buying precious hours for the main line to regroup. The result was a grinding war of attrition, one that frustrated Allied hopes for a swift victory. The Gothic line thus became a symbol of German resilience in Italy, showcasing Kesselring's skill at prolonging the campaign despite dwindling resources. His ability to delay the Allies tied down divisions that might have otherwise been deployed in France or the Balkans, indirectly shaping the broader course of the war. As autumn descended on the Apennines, the Gothic line battles grew fiercer and more desperate. In September 1944, the Allies launched their most intense assaults yet, with the 8th Army pushing toward Rimini and the 5th Army driving on Bologna. Progress came at the cost of staggering casualties, as villages were reduced to rubble by artillery duels and mountain passes became graveyards of shattered equipment. The fighting saw remarkable feats of endurance, with Polish and Canadian troops clawing their way up steep ridges, while Indian Gurkhas scaled cliffs under cover of darkness. German paratroopers, some of the most elite soldiers of the Reich, fought back with equal ferocity, refusing to yield ground without inflicting maximum losses. The constant rain turned trenches into quagmires, and soldiers lived in conditions of mud, cold, and exhaustion. Still, both sides fought on, knowing the outcome of Italy's campaign hinged on these brutal engagements. The Gothic line, though penetrated in places, remained unbroken as a cohesive system, continuing to stall the Allied advance. By late 1944, the Allied offensive had stalled, its momentum exhausted against the unyielding defences. The capture of Rimini, and the slow progress into the Emilia-Romagna plains, offered some victories, but Bologna remained firmly in German hands. The weather turned against the Allies as well, with autumn rains followed by early winter snows further crippling movement. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, while exhausted soldiers faced the grim prospect of fighting through another winter in Italy. For civilians caught in the crossfire, life became unbearable, as villages were bombarded, farmland ruined, and thousands displaced. Resistance movements provided intelligence and sabotage, but reprisals by German troops were swift and brutal. The Gothic Line campaign thus dragged on, draining Allied resources and morale, while buying Kesselring the one thing he valued most: time. For Hitler, this delay justified his decision to continue defending Italy, at all costs. The Gothic Line did not collapse in 1944, as the Allies had hoped, but instead endured into the spring of 1945. Its battles revealed the full cost of mountain warfare, where technology and numbers mattered less than grit, endurance, and tactical brilliance. Kesselring's defence turned Italy into a secondary theatre that nonetheless consumed vast Allied resources, shaping the timing of final offensives in Europe. Soldiers who fought there remembered it as one of the hardest campaigns of the war, marked by mud, blood, and unrelenting hardship. For the Allies, the Gothic Line became both a symbol of frustration and of determination, a reminder that even in the shadow of greater battles in France, Italy demanded its own sacrifices. For the Germans, it was their last great stand in Italy, a defence that delayed the inevitable but could not alter the outcome of the war. When the line finally broke in 1945, it opened the path to the Po Valley and the final liberation of northern Italy. But in 1944, it stood defiant, the mountain fortress where the fate of Italy was contested, ridge by ridge, village by village. As German occupation tightened its grip on northern and central Italy, a new form of warfare began to emerge from the shadows: the resistance. It was not fought with tanks or artillery, but with the courage of men and women who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain in reclaiming their homeland. These groups, calling themselves partisans, were scattered across valleys, mountain villages, and hidden forests, where they used terrain to their advantage. Their beginnings were small, often nothing more than bands of students, escaped prisoners of war, or deserters from Mussolini's shattered army. Yet what they lacked in firepower, they made up for in resourcefulness, determination, and an unshakable hatred for fascism and Nazi rule. Italy's countryside became a battleground of ambushes and sabotage, carried out under constant threat of betrayal. The Germans quickly understood the danger posed by this underground war, and their response was swift and merciless. Villages suspected of sheltering partisans were burned, and entire populations were made examples of through executions and deportations. Still, the resistance grew, fueled by outrage at these atrocities. What began as scattered sparks of defiance soon became a blaze of organized rebellion. The geography of Italy played directly into partisan warfare, offering countless places to hide and strike. Mountainous terrain, dense woodlands, and isolated rural villages provided both sanctuary and staging grounds for attacks. Railroads, bridges, and supply convoys were prime targets, for disrupting German logistics was far more effective than direct confrontation. Resistance groups often operated at night, descending from mountain strongholds to plant explosives, derail trains, or ambush patrols before melting back into the landscape. These operations required intimate knowledge of terrain, passed down by local farmers and shepherds who risked their lives to help. Arms were scarce, and many early raids relied on stolen rifles, smuggled pistols, or even captured German weapons. But with Allied support beginning to trickle in, weapons drops by parachute brought much-needed supplies, giving the resistance greater firepower and morale. Each successful sabotage, no matter how small, struck a psychological blow against German authority. Fear spread through occupying troops who realized that no convoy, no patrol, and no officer was truly safe. The resistance was not a single unified army, but a mosaic of movements with different ideologies, goals, and methods. Some groups were rooted in communist cells, eager to overthrow fascism and establish a new social order after the war. Others were monarchist or Catholic, fighting simply to restore national dignity and reclaim independence. Despite these differences, necessity forced cooperation, for only through joint action could they hope to challenge the German war machine. The political tensions within the resistance were real, yet survival in a world of constant danger often bridged ideological divides. Leaders emerged from unexpected backgrounds: schoolteachers, farmers, factory workers, and intellectuals, each thrust into command by circumstance. Coordination remained difficult, as communication lines were primitive and infiltration by fascist informants was a constant threat. Still, as Allied forces pushed northward, these partisan groups began to serve as the long arm of liberation, harassing German rear guards and slowing their retreat. Their contributions were not merely symbolic, but militarily significant. Sabotage was the lifeblood of the resistance, and it took many forms, ranging from derailed trains to assassinations of high-ranking officials. One of the most feared tactics was the ambush of convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, or soldiers through narrow mountain roads. Partisans would block a road with felled trees or boulders, force vehicles to halt, and then strike with sudden, overwhelming violence. Assassinations in city centres targeted fascist officials and collaborators, often carried out in broad daylight to send a message of defiance. Such acts carried immense risks, as German reprisals were swift and brutal. For every officer killed, civilians might be executed in retaliation, turning towns into theatres of collective punishment. Yet the resistance persisted, understanding that silence in the face of tyranny would mean the death of Italy's soul. By making occupation costly and uncertain, they eroded German control from within. The civilian population stood at the heart of this underground war, both its lifeblood and its greatest victim. Farmers provided food, women acted as couriers, and children carried messages hidden in baskets or schoolbooks. Safe houses sheltered fugitives, and barns or caves concealed weapons caches. The danger of betrayal loomed constantly, as informants or coerced locals might expose resistance cells. German counterinsurgency units conducted brutal sweeps, burning villages and massacring inhabitants suspected of aiding partisans. The memory of such atrocities, like those at Marzabotto and Sant'Anna di Stazzema, where hundreds of civilians were slaughtered, etched permanent scars into the Italian landscape. Yet these horrors often had the opposite effect of what the occupiers intended. Rather than crushing resistance, they strengthened resolve, as grieving communities channeled their pain into the struggle for liberation. Ordinary Italians, once hesitant, became willing to risk everything for revenge and freedom. The role of women in the resistance was both vital and underestimated. Women acted as spies, couriers, and sometimes fighters, moving more easily through checkpoints under the guise of daily chores. They smuggled weapons in market baskets, passed coded notes, and carried intelligence between towns and partisan units. Some took up arms directly, engaging in firefights alongside men in the mountains. Their bravery often went unrecognized in the immediate post-war years, but without their efforts, the resistance would have struggled to survive. Women endured torture, imprisonment, and execution at the hands of German and fascist forces, yet they rarely betrayed their comrades. Their contribution added a new dimension to the war effort, showing that resistance was not merely military, but a total struggle involving every segment of society. The partisan fight was not just about battlefield victories, but about preserving the dignity and spirit of an entire people. As the Allies advanced northward in 1944, the resistance intensified its operations, serving as both an auxiliary force and a symbol of Italian self-liberation. Partisan groups coordinated with Allied commanders, providing intelligence about German troop movements and sabotaging enemy logistics to support offensives. They cut telephone lines, destroyed bridges, and disrupted supply convoys at critical moments, weakening German defences before Allied attacks. In many cases, partisans held mountain passes or liberated small towns on their own, raising the Italian tricolour in defiance. These acts fostered a sense of national pride, showing that Italians were not passive victims but active agents in their own liberation. Yet cooperation with the Allies was not always smooth, as concerns about post-war political control simmered beneath the surface. Still, in the crucible of battle, practical necessity outweighed ideological disputes. Together, they formed a patchwork of resistance and liberation that ground down German strength. By late 1944 and into 1945, the partisan struggle reached its zenith, culminating in widespread uprisings across northern Italy. As German defences crumbled under Allied pressure, partisan units seized cities like Milan, Genoa, and Turin, often days before Allied troops could arrive. These dramatic insurrections marked the moment when Italians themselves reclaimed their country, not merely as liberated subjects, but as active participants in victory. The capture and execution of Benito Mussolini by partisans in April 1945 symbolized the final collapse of fascism, ending a dark chapter of tyranny. In these closing months, the sacrifices of countless men and women found their vindication, as their clandestine struggle turned into open triumph. The resistance had been born in secrecy, nurtured in suffering, and consecrated in blood. Its legacy lived on not only in the liberation of Italy, but in the memory of courage against impossible odds. The partisans proved that even in the darkest years of occupation, freedom's flame could never be extinguished. Behind the front lines of Italy's long war lay a hidden battlefield, one fought not with rifles and tanks, but with hunger, fear, and relentless destruction. For civilians, survival became a daily gamble, where the simple act of finding bread or crossing a street could mean the difference between life and death. Allied bombing campaigns aimed at disrupting German supply lines and industry rained devastation upon towns and cities, killing thousands who had no role in the fighting. Railway hubs, ports, and factories became prime targets, but the surrounding neighbourhoods filled with families bore the brunt of the explosions. In Rome, Naples, and Milan, entire districts were reduced to rubble, leaving the homeless to wander through shattered streets in search of safety. German reprisals against partisan activity brought further terror, as entire villages were massacred in cold blood. The countryside echoed with gunfire and flames as punitive raids left behind smoking ruins and mass graves. For ordinary Italians, there was no safe refuge, only shifting zones of misery. The war consumed not only armies, but the very fabric of society. Bombing raids became an almost daily ordeal for those living under the flight paths of Allied bombers. The sound of air raid sirens sent families scrambling for cover, huddling in basements, caves, or hastily dug shelters. Children grew up with the thunder of explosions as a constant soundtrack, their childhood stolen by the terror in the skies. Industrial cities like Turin and Genoa were relentlessly targeted, as the Allies sought to cripple German supply chains and weaken Italy's remaining war capacity. Yet precision was nearly impossible, and residential blocks, churches, and hospitals often took the hits. Civilians dug through rubble with bare hands to rescue loved ones or recover bodies for burial. Those who survived often faced displacement, as waves of refugees fled bombed-out cities for the uncertain safety of rural villages. The skies themselves became symbols of dread, as clear weather meant the bombers would surely come. Even at night, the distant drone of engines robbed families of sleep, reminding them that no place was beyond the reach of war. Famine became another cruel weapon against civilians, creeping into every corner of daily life. With fields destroyed, railways cut, and livestock seized by occupying forces, Food supplies dwindled to a fraction of what was needed. Long lines formed outside bakeries for scraps of bread, while children went barefoot and mothers bartered jewelry for a few potatoes. Black markets flourished, but prices skyrocketed beyond the reach of the poor, forcing many into desperate acts of theft or begging. Malnutrition spread, weakening bodies already strained by cold winters and ceaseless stress. German troops requisitioned grain, oil, and meat, stripping rural villages bare and leaving the farmers themselves to starve. Even in cities, ration cards provided little more than a symbolic promise, as the food they guaranteed rarely materialized. Families scavenged for edible roots or weeds, while thin soups replaced proper meals. Hunger gnawed at the population, a silent killer that claimed lives as surely as bullets and bombs. Reprisals for partisan attacks brought an especially cruel dimension to civilian suffering, as entire communities were punished for resistance they may not have even supported. In the Apennine villages, German troops and fascist loyalists executed collective punishments with ruthless efficiency. If a convoy was ambushed, the nearest village might be burned to the ground, its men shot, and its women and children scattered or deported. The massacre at Marzabotto in September 1944 epitomized this brutality. There, German SS units slaughtered more than 700 people, many of them women, children, and the elderly, in one of the most infamous atrocities of the war in Western Europe. The killings were carried out systematically, with entire families executed in barns, fields, and even churches. Survivors were left to stumble among corpses, their homes reduced to smouldering ruins. Such massacres sent waves of terror through rural Italy, a stark warning of the price of defiance. Yet instead of extinguishing the will to resist, they deepened hatred toward the occupiers and etched wounds that would never fully heal. Massacres were not isolated events, but part of a grim pattern of violence that stretched across the peninsula. In places like Sant'Anna di Stazzema, Fosse Ardeatine, and countless unnamed villages, civilians were rounded up and executed in retaliation for partisan activity. Sometimes it was a calculated act of terror, other times it was sheer rage from frustrated troops unable to catch the resistance. The scale varied, from a handful of men shot in a town square to entire hamlets wiped from the map. Women were not spared, nor were children, whose deaths revealed the utter absence of mercy in these operations. For communities, the impact went beyond physical loss. It shattered trust, as fear of informants and collaborators grew within neighborhoods. The shadow of betrayal meant no one felt entirely safe, not even among friends. The result was a climate of suspicion, grief, and quiet desperation. Italy itself seemed to become a hostage, caught between occupiers demanding obedience and resistance fighters calling for sacrifice. The psychological toll of these years was immense, leaving scars deeper than the physical destruction of cities and villages. Families were torn apart by deportations, with fathers sent to labor camps in Germany, mothers imprisoned for aiding partisans, and children orphaned by sudden acts of violence. Those who survived carried trauma into the post-war years, haunted by memories of executions, hunger, and constant fear. Entire generations grew up knowing only the reality of war, their identities shaped by survival in the face of despair. Communities, once bound by traditions and shared celebrations, found themselves fractured by loss and grief. Even when liberation came, the ghosts of the war lingered in silence and nightmares, often too painful to speak aloud. The scars were not visible in ruins alone, but etched into the faces of survivors who struggled to rebuild their lives. Rebuilding houses was easier than rebuilding trust and healing memories. For Italy, the war left wounds that could not be erased by victory. Despite the devastation, civilians also displayed remarkable resilience, adapting to impossible conditions in ways that testified to human endurance. Families cultivated hidden gardens, foraging for wild greens or raising rabbits and chickens in secret to escape requisition. Communities rebuilt makeshift shelters out of ruins, creating homes from broken walls and salvaged beams. Religious faith became a refuge, with churches, when not destroyed, serving as centers of solace and quiet defiance. Cultural traditions, songs, and local festivals, even when muted, persisted as acts of survival, reminders of identity in a world trying to erase it. Acts of kindness, from sharing food to sheltering fugitives, created small islands of hope amid the devastation. Resistance and resilience often went hand in hand, as even the act of continuing daily life became a form of defiance against tyranny. Civilians learned to endure, to survive in the cracks of destruction, and to hold on until liberation finally arrived. Their story was not only one of suffering, but of endurance under impossible odds. By the time the war in Italy drew to its end in 1945, the civilian cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands were dead, millions were displaced, and entire regions were scarred by famine and devastation. Cities lay in ruins, villages were ghostly shells, and the countryside bore the traces of massacres and mass graves. Yet even as the guns fell silent, the wounds of the hidden front endured in the hearts of survivors. The memory of bombings, hunger and reprisals lived on, shaping Italy's post-war politics and its collective sense of identity. Rebuilding the nation meant more than restoring infrastructure. It meant confronting trauma and reconciling with the shadows of fascism and occupation. The hidden front, fought in kitchens, shelters and fields, left scars as deep as any battlefield. Italy emerged liberated but forever changed, its people carrying the weight of suffering that could not be measured in maps or military communiques. It was a reminder that in war, civilians bear a burden as crushing as the armies themselves, and often one that never truly lifts. When Mussolini was rescued by German commandos from his mountain imprisonment at Gran Sasso in September 1943, it was not a triumphal return, but the beginning of his hollow afterlife as Hitler's pawn. Installed as the head of the so-called Italian Social Republic, or RSI, Mussolini was stripped of his once grandiose authority and reduced to a figurehead for a regime entirely dependent on German might. The RSI claimed sovereignty over northern and central Italy, but in reality, every major decision was dictated from Berlin. Hitler's motives were pragmatic, to prevent Italy from becoming a base for Allied advances, and to maintain a facade of fascist legitimacy for domestic control. Mussolini, weakened in body and spirit, presided over this shadow state with little enthusiasm, aware of his own irrelevance but unable to escape the role forced upon him. His speeches, once thunderous and filled with fire, now sounded weary and hollow, echoing across an audience that no longer believed in his vision. The man who had once promised empire now oversaw a puppet state collapsing under the weight of occupation and war. The RSI's capital was established in the lakeside town of Salerno, giving rise to the nickname, the Republic of Salerno. From this picturesque but isolated setting, Mussolini and his ministers attempted to govern a country that was increasingly ungovernable. German officers monitored their every move, and decisions were routinely overruled or rewritten by Nazi authorities. Ministries operated in name only, while real power resided in German field commanders and SS officials. Mussolini's ministers, many of them second-rate loyalists or opportunists, carried out directives with little competence or vision. Propaganda tried to project an image of strength, but the reality was one of chaos and fragmentation. Italian civilians in RSI territories knew the truth. This was not an independent state, but a facade designed to conceal German control. The Republic of Salerno became synonymous with weakness, repression, and betrayal. For Mussolini himself, the lakeside palace was a gilded cage, a stage where he performed the role of Duce for an audience that had already abandoned him. The RSI relied heavily on brutal militias to enforce its authority, as the regular Italian army had effectively disintegrated after the September Armistice. These militias were composed of die-hard fascists, disillusioned soldiers, and opportunistic criminals who thrived under the license to terrorize. They operated as instruments of repression, targeting resistance fighters, suspected traitors, and ordinary civilians accused of disloyalty. Black-shirted squads raided villages, dragging people from their homes and subjecting them to interrogation, torture, and summary executions. Their methods were deliberately cruel, designed to spread fear and discourage support for partisans. In many towns, the presence of fascist militias was indistinguishable from banditry, with looting, rape, and extortion commonplace. The RSI encouraged this violence because it lacked any other means of enforcing obedience. Far from restoring fascist order, the militias deepened resentment and hatred, turning the population further against Mussolini's regime. Their brutality left scars that endured long after the guns fell silent. One of the defining features of the RSI was its complete dependency on Nazi Germany. Without German troops, the RSI could not have survived even a week against the growing partisan movement and the advancing Allies. German divisions garrisoned major cities, secured transportation networks, and crushed uprisings with ruthless efficiency. Mussolini himself admitted privately that he was no longer in command, acknowledging that his country's fate rested in Hitler's hands. This dependency robbed the RSI of legitimacy, reducing it to a mere extension of German occupation. For ordinary Italians, the regime represented not independence, but subjugation under foreign boots. Even fascist loyalists were forced to recognize the bitter truth. Their leader, once a symbol of nationalist pride, was now reduced to a servant of German power. The RSI was a puppet regime in the most literal sense, its strings pulled from Berlin, while its figurehead dangled helplessly. Mussolini's ambition had shriveled into humiliation, his empire reduced to a hollow republic of shadows. The RSI also engaged in widespread collaboration with the Nazis' genocidal policies, further staining its legacy. Mussolini's regime assisted in the deportation of Italian Jews, who had already suffered under fascist racial laws since 19. With German encouragement and direct oversight, RSI police and militias rounded up Jews in northern Italy, sending thousands to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. Families who had lived in Italy for generations, believing themselves part of the nation, were betrayed by their own government. The RSI's complicity in these atrocities destroyed any lingering moral legitimacy it might have claimed. Even as the war turned against the Axis, Mussolini's ministers and enforcers doubled down on their participation in Nazi crimes, hoping to prove their loyalty to Hitler. This collaboration was not passive but active, carried out with zeal by many within the regime. It cemented the RSI's reputation as not merely a failed state, but a criminal one. For survivors, this betrayal remained one of the most bitter legacies of the fascist years. Mussolini himself was a tragic and diminished figure during the slow years. A man aware of his irrelevance but unwilling or unable to escape his fate. His health was failing, his charisma evaporated, and his speeches were met with apathy or outright scorn. He spent much of his time secluded, writing, reading, and lamenting his lost glory. In private conversations, he admitted that fascism had collapsed and that he was now a prisoner of circumstances beyond his control. Yet he also refused to relinquish his position, clinging to the illusion of leadership, even as his power shrank to almost nothing. The once grandiose Duce, who had commanded armies and reshaped Italy's political landscape, now existed as little more than a figure in a tragic farce. For many Italians, his decline symbolized the collapse of the fascist dream itself, a hollow ideology exposed for its brutality, incompetence, and ultimate failure. The Salò years were Mussolini's twilight, a slow unravelling of his myth and his authority. As the Allies advanced from the south, and partisans gained strength in the north, the RSI's grip weakened further. The countryside became a patchwork of contested zones, where German patrols, fascist militias, and partisan bands clashed in a brutal war of ambushes and reprisals. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, subject to suspicion from all sides. The RSI attempted to project strength through propaganda, promising imminent victory and denouncing the Allies as invaders, but few believed these empty words. Resistance newspapers, clandestinely distributed, painted a truer picture of the regime's fragility and corruption. For the population, loyalty to the RSI was less about belief and more about survival in a world where neutrality was impossible. The regime was dying, but it lashed out violently in its death throes, ensuring that its collapse would be soaked in blood. Mussolini presided over this chaos, increasingly detached, as if watching his own political funeral unfold before his eyes. By the spring of 1945, The RSI was collapsing under the weight of its contradictions, its German masters retreating, and its own population turning decisively against it. Mussolini's dream of restoring his empire had ended in humiliation, as he found himself presiding over a regime that was neither respected nor feared. The Italian Social Republic became synonymous with betrayal, repression, and complicity in foreign occupation. Its militias, once feared, were hunted down by partisans and despised by the communities they had terrorized. The once mighty Juice, whose speeches had once filled piazzas, now travelled in secrecy, fearing capture by his own people. When liberation finally came, the RSI was swept away like a bad memory, its leaders captured or executed, its ideology left in ruins. Mussolini's puppet state stood as the final pathetic chapter in his long descent from dictator to irrelevance. For Italy, the Republic of Salo was a wound that testified to the dangers of blind loyalty, collaboration, and the corrosive power of dictatorship in decline. The Italian campaign was never just a military affair. It was also a stage for fierce political debates within the Allied High Command. Winston Churchill, ever the strategist and historian, referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, believing that an invasion through the Mediterranean would weaken Germany's southern flank and drain Nazi resources from the Eastern Front. Franklin Roosevelt, however, remained cautious, focused on public opinion back home and on the grand design of a cross-channel invasion. Joseph Stalin, far removed in Moscow, had his own priorities. He demanded a second front in France to relieve the immense pressure his armies faced against the Wehrmacht. This triangle of competing visions created tension, as each leader balanced military necessity with political calculation. The question was not merely where to fight, but how best to hasten Germany's collapse while managing the fragile alliance, holding together three very different world leaders. Italy became a proving ground, not only for soldiers, but for diplomacy at the highest levels. Churchill's insistence on Italy as the next step after North Africa was born of both strategic reasoning and imperial instinct. He argued that Britain's forces were already well positioned in the Mediterranean, with naval superiority and access through North Africa, making Italy the logical target. He also believed that pushing into the Balkans via Italy could secure British influence in southeastern Europe, limiting Soviet expansion after the war. Roosevelt's advisors, particularly General George Marshall, were less enthusiastic, fearing that Italy would become a costly diversion from the main effort in France. Stalin viewed Churchill's Mediterranean enthusiasm with suspicion, convinced it was an attempt to delay the cross-channel invasion and leave the Soviet Union bearing the brunt of the German war machine. Each leader cloaked their motives in military logic, but beneath the surface, political ambitions and visions for the post-war world shaped every decision. Italy became less about geography and more about ideology, trust and rivalry among uneasy allies. The debates over Italy came to a head in conferences such as Casablanca in January 1943, and later in Tehran in November 1943. At Casablanca, the Allies committed to invading Sicily, which would lead to Mussolini's downfall and Italy's eventual surrender. But disagreements over the long-term value of Italy simmered in the background. By the time of the Tehran conference, Stalin pressed hard for Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France, as the centerpiece of Allied strategy. Churchill, though unable to resist Stalin's demands, still pushed for a Mediterranean option that would continue pressure in Italy and open paths toward the Balkans. Roosevelt often acted as a mediator between his fiery British partner and the blunt demands of the Soviet leader, but his sympathies leaned toward prioritizing France. Italy thus became a compromise, a secondary theatre, allowed to continue, but never fully resourced or politically unified in its purpose. Soldiers would pay the price for these compromises in blood. For the men on the ground, the political wrangling translated into prolonged stalemates and grinding battles. Troops at Anzio, Cassino, and the Gothic Line often wondered why they were fighting in mountains and valleys that seemed to lead nowhere decisive. The reality was that Italy was both strategically significant and politically neglected. While Churchill argued that every German division tied down in Italy was one less to resist Overlord, American generals bristled at the thought of their best forces slogging through mud and stone instead of preparing for Normandy. Stalin, meanwhile, viewed Italy as little more than a sideshow, a convenient distraction, but not the decisive blow he demanded. Thus, resources were always measured, reinforcements often delayed, and the campaign stretched on longer than anyone anticipated. Politics slowed strategy, and strategy shaped suffering, creating a vicious cycle that kept Italy a contested but never fully decisive battleground. Roosevelt's cautious approach was influenced by American public opinion, which had been promised a direct strike at Hitler's Fortress Europe. The US military leadership, particularly Marshall and Eisenhower, favoured the clarity of a cross-channel invasion where Allied might could be concentrated in one overwhelming blow. Italy, by contrast, seemed messy, mountainous and secondary, a drain on morale and resources. Churchill's eloquence kept Italy alive in Allied councils, but even he could not win unlimited commitment. At times, British and American generals openly clashed, with arguments over whether divisions should be withdrawn from Italy to prepare for France. These disagreements created a fractured command structure, where generals had to balance military necessity with political orders from faraway leaders. The Italian campaign became an awkward hybrid, strategically significant enough to continue, but never decisive enough to receive the full attention of the Allies' industrial and military power. The Soviet perspective remained central to the tension. Stalin, presiding over a nation bleeding on the Eastern Front, could not afford to indulge in Mediterranean detours. Each day his armies fought battles of annihilation against the Wehrmacht. He demanded tangible relief. Italy, in his eyes, did not constitute the second front he had been promised. When Overlord was finally scheduled for June 1944, Stalin pressed even harder for maximum commitment, leaving Italy as an afterthought. This sense of betrayal lingered in Soviet memory, shaping post-war suspicion of Western motives. While Western leaders pointed to Italy's role in weakening Germany, the Soviets dismissed it as political theatre. For Stalin, the only real measure of Allied loyalty was the number of German divisions pinned down in France, not in the rugged hills of the Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign, therefore, became a symbol of both cooperation and mistrust, a reminder of how fragile the Grand Alliance truly was. Despite the political disputes, the Italian campaign produced undeniable strategic benefits. It knocked Italy out of the war, removing a major Axis partner and forcing Germany to divert troops to occupy the peninsula. It also provided valuable experience in amphibious landings, coordination between multinational forces, and combined arms operations, all of which would be crucial in Normandy. Yet these benefits were rarely celebrated at the political level, overshadowed by arguments over priority and allocation of resources. Soldiers who endured the bitter battles of Monte Cassino or the mud of the Apennines often felt like forgotten warriors, fighting a war whose significance was doubted even by their own leaders. This disconnect between the battlefield and the conference table was one of the defining characteristics of the Italian campaign. It revealed how strategy was not only a matter of maps and terrain, but of egos, ambitions, and the fragile balance of an uneasy alliance. In the end, the politics of the Italian campaign underscored the uneasy marriage of convenience that bound the Allies together. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin shared the common goal of defeating Hitler, but their visions for how and for what world would follow were often irreconcilable. Italy, more than any other theatre, exposed these divisions. It was at once a victory and a distraction, a campaign that shaped the downfall of fascism, but failed to achieve decisive military breakthrough. For Italy itself, this ambiguity meant prolonged suffering, as its towns and people became pawns in a war shaped as much by diplomacy as by strategy. For historians, the Italian campaign is not just the story of soldiers advancing up a peninsula, it is also the story of leaders wrestling with mistrust, compromise, and the burden of shaping a post-war order. In this way, Italy stands as both a battlefield and a boardroom, a place where strategy was forged in equal measure by blood and by politics. By the spring of 1945, the Italian campaign had become a long, grinding struggle. but its climax was now in sight. For months, Allied armies had inched their way north, battling through mountain ridges, river crossings, and well-prepared German defences that seemed endless. Yet behind the stubborn German lines, the Axis war machine was collapsing elsewhere in Europe, and Italy was destined to feel the shockwaves. Adolf Hitler's armies had been forced back across the Rhine, and the Soviets were driving relentlessly toward Berlin, leaving Kesselring's successor, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, with little hope of reinforcement. The Allies in Italy, American Fifth Army under General Lucian Truscott, and British Eighth Army under General Richard McCreary, prepared to deliver the final hammer blow. The goal was not just to break the Gothic line remnants, but to shatter German resistance altogether and open the Po Valley. After years of stalemate, commanders envisioned a swift and decisive end, a campaign that could finally liberate northern Italy. The plan became known as the Spring Offensive, a massive coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the last German defences. It would begin in April, when the winter snows melted, the rivers ran high, and mobility returned to the battlefield. The final act of Italy's long and bloody war was about to unfold with thunderous force. The Allies meticulously prepared for the offensive, amassing vast supplies of artillery, tanks, and aircraft to ensure overwhelming superiority. By April, they had nearly 2 million men in theatre, including British, American, Polish, Brazilian, Canadian, and South African units, along with Italian co-belligerent forces eager to reclaim their homeland. Air power was the decisive edge, with thousands of Allied planes poised to hammer bridges, railways, and German troop concentrations across northern Italy. The German 10th and 14th Armies, dug into defensive positions south of the Po River, were badly under strength, suffering from desertion, poor supply, and declining morale. Their positions, however, were still formidable, anchored by natural barriers like the Sinio and Salerno rivers. The Allies planned a two-pronged thrust. The 8th Army would smash through on the Adriatic flank, while the 5th Army struck west of Bologna. Artillery barrages were calibrated down to the minute, ensuring no gap in fire as infantry advanced behind creeping barrages. Engineers prepared bridges and pontoons to cross swollen rivers under fire, knowing speed was essential. The offensive was set to begin with a storm of steel that would leave no doubt about Allied superiority. For German soldiers entrenched in bunkers, the coming assault promised annihilation. On April 9, 1945, the offensive began with a cataclysm of firepower that shook the earth. Allied artillery unleashed tens of thousands of shells in carefully coordinated waves, saturating German positions along the Senio River. Following the barrage, bombers and fighter bombers struck relentlessly, ploughing the defensive belts with explosives and napalm, turning trenches and strongpoints into burning wreckage. Then came the infantry, advancing behind smoke screens, with flamethrower teams and Churchill crocodile tanks clearing bunkers one by one. The German defences cracked under the pressure, but resistance remained stubborn in pockets, particularly among SS units who fought with fanatical determination. The Allied troops pressed forward relentlessly, exploiting every breach with armour and infantry coordination. Polish units on the left and Indian divisions on the right helped widen the bridgeheads, forcing the Germans into rapid withdrawals. Each river crossing became a desperate contest, with engineers building under fire, while soldiers ferried across in rubber boats. Yet momentum was on the Allies' side, and the line that had held so long began to crumble. The spring sky filled with the roar of aircraft, and the offensive surged forward like a tidal wave. The Battle of Bologna marked the centerpiece of the offensive, where the American Fifth Army struck with devastating precision. General Truscott's forces, including US II Corps and Brazilian expeditionary units, launched assaults through the western sector, aiming to cut German escape routes across the Apennines. Fighting was fierce, with German machine guns raking advancing troops and artillery barrages pounding assembly areas. But Allied coordination proved decisive. Infantry advanced behind curtains of fire, while armour punched through weakened defences to encircle German positions. By mid-April, Bologna was threatened from both east and west, trapping German forces between converging armies. On April 23rd, Allied units entered the city, greeted by exhausted civilians who had endured months of bombing and occupation. The The fall of Bologna split the German front wide open, forcing retreats across the Po Valley. Roads clogged with retreating Wehrmacht columns, their discipline unravelling as supplies dwindled and command structures disintegrated. For the Allies, it was the long-awaited breakthrough, a signal that the end of the campaign was near. Yet the final pursuit northward would still exact a bloody toll. Once Bologna fell, the offensive turned into a relentless pursuit, with Allied armour and motorised infantry racing across the fertile plains of the Po Valley. The terrain, flat and open, allowed tanks and mechanised columns to surge forward with unprecedented speed compared to the years of mountain warfare. German rearguards fought delaying actions, blowing bridges and laying mines, but their resistance lacked cohesion. Allied engineers worked day and night to repair crossings, while air power rained destruction on retreating German convoys. Brazilian troops captured entire German divisions, while Polish and New Zealand units advanced with remarkable speed across the Adriatic side. The once formidable Wehrmacht in Italy was collapsing into pockets of surrender, with thousands of troops throwing down their arms. Villages and towns erupted in celebration as partisans emerged from hiding to join the fight, ambushing retreating Germans and seizing local control. The Po River crossings became the final obstacle, but Allied speed ensured bridgeheads were secured before the Germans could regroup. By late April, the Allies had surged beyond the Po, cutting off remaining German forces in northern Italy. The campaign that once seemed endless was now racing toward its conclusion. The role of the Italian partisans in this final phase was both dramatic and decisive. For months they had harassed German lines, sabotaged railways and carried out assassinations. But in April their uprising became full-scale warfare. As Allied forces advanced, partisans struck in cities like Milan, Genoa and Turin, liberating them even before Allied troops arrived. Bridges were seized intact, German supply dumps captured, and fascist loyalists hunted down by enraged civilians. In Milan, the partisans would soon capture Mussolini himself, an act that symbolised the collapse of fascist authority once and for all. The partisan war created chaos behind German lines, leaving Wehrmacht units exposed and isolated. Civilians, long terrorised by reprisals and massacres, now exacted vengeance against retreating occupiers. Allied commanders welcomed the uprising, which accelerated the disintegration of German defences and reduced the need for costly urban fighting. The combination of Allied armoured speed and partisan insurrection created a pincer that the Germans could not withstand. Italy's liberation was now being written not only by foreign armies, but by its own people rising in defiance. The collapse of the Axis in Italy was as much political as it was military. By April 29th, German forces in Italy were in full collapse, their lines shattered, and commanders recognizing the futility of further resistance. General Vietinghoff and SS General Karl Wolff began negotiations with the Allies at Caserta, seeking terms of surrender. On May 2, the formal capitulation of all German forces in Italy took place, just days before Germany's total surrender in Europe. Nearly 1 million Axis troops laid down their arms, one of the largest mass surrenders of the war. The once unyielding German defence, which had held for nearly 2 years, had crumbled in just 3 weeks of relentless Allied assault. For Allied soldiers, the victory brought relief, but also reflection, as they counted the cost of years spent fighting through mountains and valleys for ground that often seemed hopeless. For Italians, liberation meant both joy and reckoning, as the wounds of occupation, civil war and partisan justice would leave deep scars. The spring offensive of April 1945 was more than a military victory. It was the culmination of sacrifice, endurance and determination in a campaign often overshadowed by Normandy and the Eastern Front. It showed how even in a theatre deemed secondary, Allied cooperation, relentless planning and sheer persistence could bring decisive results. The collapse of German defences in Italy freed Allied armies to focus entirely on the final defeat of Nazi Germany, while also shaping the political landscape of post-war Europe. The liberation of northern Italy paved the way for a new republic, born from resistance and struggle against tyranny. For the soldiers who marched into Milan, Venice and Genoa, the cheers of liberated crowds were the reward for years of hardship. Yet beneath the celebrations lay the silent memory of Anzio, Casino, and the Gothic Line, where so many had fallen for each step forward. The campaign revealed that even a diversionary front carried immense weight in blood and consequence. In April 1945, the war in Italy ended not with stalemate, but with thunderous triumph. The Po Valley became the stage of final victory, where the long road of liberation finally reached its end. The Italian campaign, often doubted, had delivered its final decisive act. As the Allies and partisans advanced through northern Italy in late April 1945, Benito Mussolini faced the collapse of everything he had built over 2 decades. The fascist regime he once controlled with iron discipline was unravelling, while his German allies retreated in disarray, abandoning the northern territories. Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland, hoping to escape capture and perhaps negotiate some semblance of safety. Accompanied by his mistress, Clara Petacci, and a small retinue of loyal fascist officials, he disguised himself among German troops and civilian refugees. The journey north was perilous, littered with destroyed roads, partisan ambushes, and the chaos of retreating Axis forces. News of advancing partisans and Allied columns spread rapidly, leaving Mussolini increasingly isolated and desperate. His former enforcers, the Blackshirts, had largely deserted or been killed, eroding the last pillars of his authority. The Duce's once commanding figure, feared across Italy, was reduced to a fugitive hunted by the very people he had terrorized. Every passing village heightened the danger, as Italian resistance fighters set up roadblocks and checkpoints. The end, long predicted by both enemies and disillusioned Italians, was now unavoidable. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini's flight came to a decisive halt near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. A unit of Italian partisans, part of the National Liberation Committee, intercepted his convoy while they were travelling in German-marked vehicles. The partisans, experienced in ambush tactics and identification of fleeing fascists, quickly identified Mussolini despite attempts at disguise. Clara Petacci remained close at his side, showing loyalty even in the face of imminent death. The partisans interrogated the group, confirming Mussolini's identity through papers, eyewitness recognition, and distinctive features long familiar across Italy. Tension filled the air as the captured fascist leaders realized their fate was sealed. The partisans had no intention of allowing Mussolini to escape justice. The capture represented not just the end of a single man, but the symbolic collapse of the entire fascist hierarchy in northern Italy. Once in partisan custody, Mussolini faced interrogation that revealed both desperation and denial. He attempted to justify his actions, blaming the Germans, the Allies, and even the Italian people for his failures. Yet the partisans, who had endured years of terror, had little patience for excuses. Mussolini's once commanding voice faltered under the scrutiny of those he had once sought to suppress. Discussions among partisan leaders determined that immediate execution was necessary to prevent a German rescue and to send a clear signal to remaining fascists. Orders were prepared, and preparations made for the grim task that would end Mussolini's life. Meanwhile, Clara Petacci remained resolutely at his side, refusing separation even as the danger of death loomed. The partisans meticulously planned the execution to avoid unnecessary chaos, but ensure the certainty of Mussolini's end. On April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were executed near the village of Giulino di Mezzagra. The partisans chose a secluded location to carry out the execution quickly and decisively, ensuring no chance of rescue or interference. Accounts indicate that Mussolini faced his death with a mixture of defiance, fear, and disbelief, understanding that his fate was now irrevocable. Petacci was executed alongside him, a tragic figure whose loyalty sealed her own demise. After the shots were fired, the bodies were transported to Milan for public display, a deliberate act meant to serve as a potent symbol of the end of fascism. The corpses were hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto, where Mussolini had once ordered the public execution of partisans in 19. Citizens crowded the square, some jeering, some silently mourning the victims of fascist rule, all witnessing the tangible collapse of tyranny. Newspapers and radio broadcasts quickly spread the news across Italy, cementing Mussolini's death in collective memory. The act was not merely punitive, It was historical, a deliberate closing of a chapter that had brought suffering, war, and oppression to millions. Italy had, in a single day, reclaimed a moral and political reckoning that had been long delayed. The symbolic nature of Mussolini's execution resonated far beyond Italy. Across Europe, it represented the imminent collapse of the Axis powers and the unravelling of dictatorships built on violence and fear. For Allied commanders, it demonstrated the efficacy of local resistance in complementing conventional military operations. The Italian partisans' decisive action showcased the interplay of military and civilian initiative in the closing months of the war. Yet the spectacle of Mussolini's death also served as a warning about the perils of personality cults and unchecked authority. His demise became a reference point in post-war trials, literature, and historical analysis. In Milan, citizens documented every moment, capturing photographs and recording oral testimonies that would later inform history. Mussolini's execution, while brutal, was intended to prevent the possibility of martyrdom or escape that might have prolonged fascist influence. The dramatic images and eyewitness accounts ensured that the collapse of fascism was undeniable and unrepeatable. It marked a definitive break from the oppressive structures that had gripped Italy for over 2 decades. The public display, though macabre, became a historical testament to the cost of dictatorship. The psychological impact on Italians was profound. Shaping the immediate post-war years, many felt a mix of relief, triumph, and sorrow, recognizing the liberation of their nation, but also mourning the loss of life caused by fascist and German occupation. The executions of Mussolini and Petacci allowed the Italian people to confront their history directly, facing both the leaders and collaborators who had brought war to their towns. Survivors of massacres, bombings, and repression could now see justice enacted, however imperfectly. Local partisans, often young men and women, found validation for years of resistance and sacrifice. Simultaneously, Italy faced the daunting task of reconstruction, politically, socially, and economically. The Italian Social Republic collapsed almost overnight, leaving a power vacuum that would be filled by provisional governments and later the Italian Republic. Debates about accountability, collaboration, and memory began immediately, shaping the narratives that would define post-war Italy. Mussolini's death became a focal point for these discussions, symbolizing the necessity of reckoning with tyranny. It was both an ending and a beginning, a moment of closure for a nation long divided by fear and ideology. Internationally, Mussolini's capture and execution sent ripples through remaining Axis and neutral nations. In Germany, the news contributed to a sense of inevitability about the war's outcome, reinforcing the collapsing morale of troops and civilians alike. In neutral countries, observers analyzed the event as a case study in revolutionary justice, the limits of dictatorship, and the power of organized resistance. Allied leaders recognized the symbolic importance of Mussolini's death, but were cautious to highlight it as a tactical and moral success rather than a spectacle. The execution illustrated that political and military collapse could be decisive and irreversible when local actors were empowered and coordinated with advancing armies. Historians would later emphasize the fusion of partisan initiative with conventional military pressure as the key factor in Mussolini's demise. The narrative of capture and execution provided a clear moral resolution, contrasting sharply with the often protracted battles still raging elsewhere in Europe. It demonstrated that dictatorship could be dismantled not only through prolonged military engagements, but also by strategic and courageous civilian resistance. The story of Mussolini's fall became emblematic of the larger collapse of fascism across Europe. His end was both final and instructive, resonating through decades of historical study. The execution of Benito Mussolini, on April 28, 1945, closed the chapter on one of the most notorious dictators of the 20th century. It symbolized the absolute failure of fascist ideology and the triumph of collective resistance against tyranny. For Italy, it represented both liberation and the daunting work of rebuilding a nation from the ruins of dictatorship and war. The image of Mussolini's body hanging in Piazzale Loreto remains etched in historical memory as a stark lesson in the consequences of unchecked power. The event underscored the intertwined nature of military, political, and civilian forces in shaping history. Across Europe, it served as a cautionary tale about the fragility of oppressive regimes in the face of sustained opposition. For future generations, Mussolini's capture and execution became a symbol of justice, vengeance, and the restoration of societal order. It reminded the world that even the most formidable leaders are mortal, and that authority rooted in fear and violence will ultimately collapse. Italy's liberation was complete, but its scars endured, shaping the nation's post-war identity and its approach to democracy and human rights. Mussolini's death, violent and symbolic, marked the definitive end of fascist Italy. The Italian campaign of World War II left an indelible mark on both the landscape and the collective memory of the nation. From the beaches of Sicily to the heights of the Apennines, the battles exacted a staggering human cost, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed or wounded. Entire towns were reduced to rubble by relentless bombardments, artillery duels, and scorched earth tactics employed by retreating German forces. Italian partisans, often young and untrained, bore the brunt of reprisals, facing executions, deportations, and the destruction of their villages. The Allied soldiers, drawn from across the globe, endured grueling terrain, entrenched defences, and fierce counterattacks, testing their endurance and resolve. The campaign revealed the complexity of war in Italy, where mountains, rivers, and cities became natural fortresses that slowed even the most determined advances. For civilians, the conflict was not abstract, it was an omnipresent threat to survival, livelihood, and family. Yet amid the destruction, moments of resilience and solidarity emerged, illustrating the human capacity for endurance. Historians continue to examine the balance between strategic necessity and the immense suffering it caused. The Italian campaign became both a military and moral crucible, shaping post-war reflections on warfare and strategy. Strategically, the Italian campaign diverted German resources from other fronts, contributing indirectly to the eventual Allied victory in Europe. Churchill famously described Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe. Yet the reality proved far more challenging, with entrenched German positions turning Sicily, the Gustav Line, and the Gothic Line into formidable obstacles. The campaign demonstrated the interplay between conventional warfare and guerrilla resistance, as partisans provided intelligence, disrupted supply lines, and engaged in sabotage behind enemy lines. Political considerations also shaped operations, as the Allies balanced the desire for rapid progress with the need to minimize civilian casualties and maintain post-war stability. The liberation of Rome, symbolic as it was, underscored the fusion of military achievement and political messaging. Nevertheless, the debate over the campaign's necessity remains, with some historians questioning whether the diversion of troops delayed the liberation of France and contributed to prolonged fighting. Italy became a testing ground for multinational cooperation, combining British, American, French, Canadian, and colonial troops in complex operations. The campaign also revealed tensions between high command strategies and frontline realities, as generals faced unpredictable terrain and determined defenders. Despite the costs, Italy's liberation demonstrated the resilience of both local and Allied forces. The campaign's legacy is thus a mixture of triumph, tragedy, and tactical learning that influenced future military doctrine. The human cost of the Italian campaign extends beyond the battlefield, permeating the social and cultural fabric of the nation. Civilians endured famine, forced labour, and the constant threat of reprisals as towns changed hands repeatedly between Axis and Allied control. The massacre at Marzabotto, the destruction of villages like Sant'Anna di Stasima, and countless smaller atrocities left deep scars on local populations. Refugees fled bombed cities, facing exposure, hunger, and disease as they sought safety in unfamiliar territories. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, forced into roles of survival amid chaos, caring for families while navigating perilous landscapes. These experiences forged resilience, as communities organized clandestine aid networks, hiding children and distributing scarce resources. The post-war narrative of Italy is inseparable from these civilian sacrifices, shaping memory, literature, and commemorative practices. Monuments, museums, and local histories preserve these stories, emphasizing both suffering and the courage of ordinary Italians. The psychological impact lingered for decades, influencing political, social, and cultural developments in post-war Italy. Ultimately, the campaign's human toll illustrates the profound cost of liberation when conducted amid populated, contested territory. The military lessons of the Italian campaign continue to inform modern strategy and doctrine. The difficult terrain from mountainous Apennines to river valleys forced planners to integrate engineering, air support, and logistics in unprecedented ways. Amphibious operations like Salerno and Anzao revealed the challenges of coordination under fire, while combined arms assaults tested the integration of armour, infantry, and artillery. The campaign highlighted the critical role of intelligence, reconnaissance, and local collaboration, particularly in identifying minefields, ambushes, and fortified positions. German defensive innovation, exemplified by the Gustav and Gothic lines, underscored the effectiveness of well-prepared terrain in slowing superior forces. Allied adaptation to these defences demonstrated the importance of flexibility, patience, and innovation in high-stakes operations. Moreover, the campaign offered lessons in coalition warfare, as political and military goals had to be negotiated across diverse national forces. Training, communication, and logistical coordination emerged as decisive factors in the eventual success. The Italian theatre became a laboratory for understanding modern combined operations in complex terrain. Its legacy is reflected in contemporary military planning, particularly in mountainous or urban environments. Culturally and socially, the Italian campaign reshaped national identity and collective memory. The stories of partisans, soldiers, and civilians became foundational narratives of resistance, heroism, and survival. Literature, film, and oral histories immortalized these experiences, capturing both the brutality and humanity of the conflict. The campaign also exposed deep divisions within Italian society between fascist collaborators and resistance fighters, and between occupied populations and retreating German forces. Reconciliation and reconstruction required confronting these painful truths, creating a post-war discourse around responsibility, memory, and justice. Festivals, commemorations, and local monuments became touchstones for remembrance, emphasizing both sacrifice and the hard-won liberation of Italian communities. The campaign highlighted the agency of ordinary citizens, challenging the notion that historical outcomes are solely determined by generals and political leaders. These narratives helped shape Italy's post-war democratic identity, emphasizing resilience, civic duty, and moral accountability. Internationally, the campaign reinforced the importance of civilian experience in wartime history. Ultimately, the Italian campaign's cultural imprint underscores the intertwining of military events with social consciousness and historical memory. Economically, Italy faced immense devastation, with infrastructure, factories, and transportation networks heavily damaged or destroyed. Roads, bridges, and rail lines were systematically targeted by retreating German forces or destroyed in strategic Allied bombardments. Agricultural regions suffered as fields were left untended, livestock slaughtered, and irrigation systems damaged. Rebuilding required years of labour, investment, and planning, with the Italian government relying on both domestic efforts and Allied aid through programs like the Marshall Plan. Cities like Naples, Rome, and Florence faced reconstruction challenges, balancing heritage preservation with modern infrastructure needs. The disruption of commerce combined with population displacement created widespread poverty and hardship. Industrial recovery became central to post-war Italian growth, with lessons from wartime logistics informing reconstruction strategies. The Italian campaign thus left a dual legacy, a landscape of destruction and a framework for systematic national rebuilding. Its economic consequences reverberated for decades, shaping both policy and regional disparities. Through this lens, the campaign is understood not just as a military endeavour, but as a defining event in modern Italian economic history. Politically, the campaign altered the balance of power within Italy and influenced the broader Allied strategy. The fall of Mussolini and the collapse of the fascist regime enabled the provisional government to negotiate Italy's surrender and eventual alignment with the Allies. The campaign also demonstrated the strategic leverage of civilian resistance in shaping political outcomes, as partisan networks directly affected territorial control. Debates over the campaign's necessity and cost emerged, both during the war and in post-war analysis, influencing Allied planning in subsequent operations. Italy's experience served as a case study in the interaction of military, political, and civilian spheres during complex operations. The establishment of the Italian Republic in 1946 reflected lessons learned about authoritarianism, coalition governance, and civilian empowerment. International observers used Italy as a blueprint for post-conflict stabilization, highlighting the importance of local engagement and transitional authority. The campaign underscored the limitations of purely military solutions in politically charged theatres. It also cemented Italy's role as a liberated yet deeply scarred nation in post-war Europe. Ultimately, the Italian campaign reshaped both national governance and international strategic thinking. The legacy of the Italian campaign is a mosaic of liberation, suffering, and rebirth, emblematic of the broader human cost of World War II. It demonstrated that freedom comes with immense sacrifice, and that military victories are inseparable from civilian experiences of hardship and courage. The mountains, valleys, and cities of Italy became both battlegrounds and symbols, representing resilience, ingenuity, and the tragic toll of war. Historians, scholars, and citizens continue to study this campaign for its lessons in strategy, coalition warfare, and the ethical dimensions of conflict. Italy emerged from the campaign profoundly transformed, politically, socially, and economically, carrying scars that shaped its post-war identity. Monuments, museums, and literature preserve the memory of those who fought, suffered, and died, ensuring that their stories endure. The campaign's narrative of struggle and perseverance serves as both warning and inspiration for future generations. It reminds the world that war is never abstract. It is measured in lives, landscapes, and the resilience of human spirit. The Italian campaign stands as a testament to courage, strategy, and the enduring quest for liberation. In reflecting on its legacy, we confront both the cost of tyranny and the power of collective resolve.